Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. I was working the night shift at a gas station off Highway 70 in northern New Mexico. The kind of place people only stop at because there's nothing else for 50 miles in either direction. It was late June, hot even after midnight, the kind of heat that sticks to everything. I was halfway through my shift, alone, trying to stay awake by restocking shelves and wiping down the counter for the third time. The night had been dead quiet until around 2:15 a.m. when the sky outside lit up. Not like lightning, more like someone set off a massive camera flash across the desert. For a second, everything was white. I saw every grain of dust in the air, every shadow cast sharp and wrong against the windows. The lights in the store flickered, but they didn't go out. I stepped outside to look, but by then it was dark again. No sound, no trail, nothing in the sky, just silence. Even the insects had stopped. A few minutes later, I saw headlights coming down the highway. Two bright beams moving fast, then slowing as they turned into the lot. A black car, some kind of older model sedan, shiny like it was just washed. It rolled up to pump 3 but didn't stop there. Instead, it pulled around and parked along the side of the building where no one usually parks. I remember thinking that was weird, because most people who come through at that hour either want gas or directions. Nobody just parks and sits. I went back behind the counter pretending to look busy, but I kept glancing up at the glass door. After maybe a minute, the bell over it rang. Two men walked in. They were dressed in black suits, real suits, like you'd wear to a funeral. Both had white shirts, black ties, black shoes that looked new. Their clothes were spotless, which stood out because dust gets on everything out there. Even if you just walk from your car to the door, you track it in. They were tall, both around the same height, pale, clean-shaven. I couldn't tell their age. Something about their faces made it hard to pin down. Not young, not old, just blank. Neither of them said anything. They didn't look at me. They walked in perfect step toward the coffee station at the back of the store. I remember the sound of their shoes. It wasn't loud, but each step hit the same rhythm like they'd practiced. I asked if they needed help. No response. Not even a glance. They just stood there by the coffee machine, one on each side of it, not doing anything. No cups, no pouring, nothing, just standing perfectly still. I tried again. Hey, you guys okay? Nothing. Not even a twitch. I started to feel that tight feeling in my chest, like when something's wrong, but you can't explain why yet. I thought maybe they were drunk or high, but they didn't move like that. They were too still. A car passed on the highway, its headlights sweeping through the windows. When the light hit them, both of them turned their heads at the exact same moment. Slow, smooth. Their faces caught the light for a second, and I swear it looked like their skin reflected it wrong. Flat, like wax. They turned back toward the wall again. I didn't know what to do, so I went to the back office to call my boss, Gary. The line rang a few times before he picked up. I started to tell him about the flash and the two men, but as I was talking, the line cut out. No click, no static, just silence. I hung up and tried again, but the phone was dead. When I came back out to the counter, the men were gone. The door hadn't chimed, and I hadn't heard a car. I stepped outside, looked around the lot. The black sedan wasn't there either, just empty highway stretching both ways. I went back in and checked the clock. It was 2:37 a.m. Somehow 20 minutes had passed. The rest of the shift was quiet. Too quiet. I kept checking the windows, expecting headlights to come back down the road, but they never did. When the morning guy showed up, Eli, I told him what happened. He laughed at first, thought I was messing with him, until I mentioned the flash. He said he'd seen it too, driving in from town, though he figured it was some kind of explosion or maybe a transformer blowing. We pulled up the security footage to check. At first, everything looked normal. I saw myself behind the counter, then stepping outside when the flash happened. The camera caught that perfectly. The desert went white for a frame or two, then back to dark. A few minutes later, the black sedan rolled in. Both men got out and walked inside. That's when we noticed it. Their faces were blurred. Not pixelated like bad resolution, but smeared, like someone had taken an eraser to just that part of the image. Every other detail was sharp, their suits, shoes, even the pattern on the floor tiles, but their faces looked like fog. We thought maybe it was a glitch, so we rewound and paused. Same thing. Every frame, blurred faces. Even when they turned toward the camera, it never caught a single clear shot. Then we watched the footage from when I went into the office. On the screen, you could see me walk back there, and in the background, the men were still standing at the coffee station. But when I came back out a few minutes later, they were gone. No door opening, no movement, nothing. Just gone. Eli asked if maybe I'd edited it, which pissed me off because why would I bother? But then he looked closer and pointed something out I hadn't noticed. When the men disappeared, the clock in the corner of the footage skipped from 2:28 to 2:37, same time gap I'd seen on the register. We checked the outside cameras next. The one pointing at the pumps caught the black sedan pulling up, but not leaving. It just sat there, parked along the wall until 2:28, and then the feed jumped. Next frame, the car was gone. The weirdest part was the reflection. The windows of the station showed a faint reflection of the pumps and the lot, and in that reflection, you could still see the car for a few frames after it was gone from the camera's main view. Then the reflection blinked out too. Eli stopped the playback and didn't say anything for a while. Then he told me not to talk about it, said Gary wouldn't believe it and we'd both just sound crazy. I worked the next few nights, nothing out of the ordinary. But every time a car came down the highway, my heart would jump a little. I'd find myself staring at the door, waiting for that chime, for those two to come back. About a week later, I came in for another overnight shift and noticed the hard drive for the security system was gone. The case was still there, but the drive that held all the recordings had been removed. I asked Gary about it, and he said someone from corporate came by that afternoon to replace it. He didn't know who exactly, said the guy showed him a work order and took it. When I asked what company he was from, Gary just said he was wearing a black suit. I quit a month later. Now, whenever I'm driving home late and see a flash in the sky, I don't stop to look. I just keep driving. But sometimes, when I pass by that old station, it's closed down now, boarded up, I swear I still see a black car parked along the side of the building. Just sitting there, lights off. I never stop to check. I was staying at a little roadside place off Route 93 in southern Nevada, just outside of Caliente. It was late March, still cool at night, but warm enough during the day that I'd leave the window cracked open a bit. I'd been there 3 nights already, working on a freelance piece for a small regional paper about rural tourism. Basically a fluff piece about ghost towns and desert hiking trails. The night before everything happened, I saw something strange out in the desert sky. I wasn't even looking for it. I was sitting on one of those plastic chairs outside my room, having a cigarette, just killing time before bed. It was maybe 10:30 p.m. The sky was clear, no wind, just that huge quiet stillness you only get out there. I noticed what I thought was a plane at first. Bright white light, steady, moving slow. But after a few seconds, I realized it wasn't moving like anything I'd seen before. It would stop, hover, then drift side to side. Then it made a perfect right-angle turn, no arc, no curve, just a sharp angle like someone dragging a cursor on a screen. I watched it for maybe a full minute, then it blinked out. Not like it faded or flew away, just gone. The next morning, I mentioned it when I was grabbing coffee in the motel lobby. The manager, this older woman named Marcy, laughed and said, "People around here see things all the time." I wasn't trying to make a big deal out of it, I just thought it was weird. But later, when I was writing up notes for my article, I decided to send a short message to the Lincoln County Sentinel, just a local blurb. Strange light observed over Highway 93 Tuesday night. That kind of thing. I sent it around noon. At 3:07 a.m., someone knocked on my door. It wasn't loud, but it was steady. 3 knocks, a pause, then another 3. I remember that because, as I thought, it might have been Marcy checking on something, though that didn't really make sense. I checked the time on my phone, then got up. When I looked through the peephole, 2 men were standing there. Both were wearing black suits, white shirts, black ties. Not tuxedo formal, just very clean, very deliberate. Their clothes looked new. Their shoes, too, like straight out of the box. They weren't dusty, which stood out because everything gets dusty there. One was slightly taller, maybe by an inch, but they looked almost identical. Same pale skin, same narrow faces, same dark hair cut too short to tell the style. The taller one smiled when he saw me looking. It wasn't a friendly smile, it looked like someone imitating one. I cracked the door open just a few inches, keeping the chain on. "Mr. Hayes?" the taller one said. His voice was calm but flat, like a customer service rep reading off a script. I told him, "Yeah, that was me. We're sorry to disturb you so early," he said. "We'd like to ask you some brief questions about a sighting you reported." It took me a second to realize what he meant. "You mean the light thing?" "Yes," he said, nodding once. "Please describe again what you observed." I remember thinking it was weird he said observed instead of saw. I started explaining. White light, strange movement, vanished suddenly. They both listened, standing perfectly still. Then the shorter one interrupted me. "How long did it look at you?" That threw me off. "I didn't say it looked at me," I said. He blinked once, slow. "You said you were watched." I hadn't said that. I told them no, I just saw a light. They both turned their heads toward each other at exactly the same time, like they were syncing. Then the taller one asked, "Have you experienced any unusual fatigue since then?" I said no. Why? He didn't answer. He just smiled again. That same wrong smile. The shorter one asked if I'd taken any photos or video. I said no, I hadn't even thought to. "Good," he said. "That's good." Then they both thanked me in unison. Literally, same words, same rhythm, and turned to leave. I shut the door, locked it, and just stood there for a minute trying to process it. I looked out the window, but the parking lot was empty. No car, no footsteps, no sound. I stayed awake the rest of the night, just lying there with the lights on. Around sunrise, I went to the front desk and asked Marcy if she'd seen anyone come by. She said no, just a couple of truckers who checked in earlier. I asked if there were security cameras. She pointed to a monitor behind the counter, one of those grainy split-screen setups. We scrolled through the footage from the night before. I watched myself go out for a smoke around 10, come back inside, lights off. Then around 3, there was nothing. No movement in the hall, no one at my door. I even saw myself open it and peek out, but the hallway was completely empty. Marcy laughed a little, like it must have been a dream. But I could tell she was uneasy. I went back to my room and sat by the window for a long time. Around noon, I saw a black sedan parked near the road, shiny, spotless, out of place among all the dusty pickups. 2 men were sitting inside, couldn't see their faces, but the suits looked the same. They didn't come closer, just sat there. After maybe 20 minutes, they drove off. I decided to check out early. I told Marcy I'd gotten the story I needed. She gave me this look, half concern, half like she didn't want to ask. I drove north toward Ely, trying to shake it off, but I kept checking the rear view. Every time I passed a black car, my stomach flipped. That night, at a motel outside of Ely, I left the TV on while I slept. Around 1 a.m., the power flickered just once, but it was enough to wake me up. I looked outside and I swear I saw headlights sitting still down the road, no engine noise. They were gone by the time I blinked. When I got home 2 days later, I found a voicemail on my phone. No caller ID, just static at first. Then a voice, flat like those text-to-speech recordings. It said, "Thank you for your cooperation." Then it clicked off. I tried calling my carrier to trace it, but there was no record of an incoming call. I stopped talking about what I saw after that, didn't file any follow-up stories, didn't mention the lights again. But a few months later, I got an envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single piece of paper, blank except for one typed line. "You were not supposed to see it move." I threw it out immediately, but for days after I kept thinking about that question one of them asked, about fatigue. Because since that night, I haven't slept through till morning once. Every single night, I wake up between 3 and 3:10 a.m. for no reason. No noise, no dream, nothing. Just suddenly wide awake, and sometimes before I open my eyes, I get the sense that someone's standing right outside the door. Not knocking this time, just waiting. It happened about 4 years ago when I was working maintenance for the state park system out in southern Nevada. I'd been assigned to inspect and photograph damage to one of the older ranger cabins on the north end of the preserve, the kind built in the 50s and barely held together by rusted nails and desert dust. It was early September, brutally hot, and the drive there took me through 50 miles of empty two-lane road that cut straight through open scrubland. I left the maintenance yard just after sunrise. By the time I got out near the dry lake bed where the cabin sat, it was already pushing 90 degrees. The air shimmered off the asphalt, and there wasn't another car in sight. I remember thinking how quiet it was out there. No birds, no wind, just that buzzing kind of silence you get in the desert when the heat's thick enough to feel like sound itself. The cabin was half collapsed. I parked about 20 yards away, took some photos, wrote down what repairs would be needed, and sat on the truck tailgate for a while, drinking warm Gatorade. That's when I saw the glint of something metallic out by the horizon. At first I thought it was a plane catching sunlight, but it didn't move like one. It was higher than a drone, but lower than any aircraft should have been, hovering in place, then sliding sideways, smooth as if it were on a track. I pulled out my phone to record it, but when I tried to zoom, the screen went black and the camera app froze. I shut it off, turned it back on, same thing. By the time I looked up again, the object was gone. I figured it was a trick of light, heat mirage, something like that. I didn't think about it much after that. On the way back toward town, I noticed a black sedan parked on the shoulder a few miles down the road. It was one of those older Lincolns, perfectly clean, windows tinted darker than legal. I slowed as I passed it, mostly out of curiosity. Couldn't see a driver, couldn't even see movement inside. It wasn't until I checked my rearview mirror that I realized it had pulled out and was now following me. I kept driving, not fast, not slow. The car stayed maybe 5 or 6 car lengths behind me the whole time. I remember trying to convince myself it was just a coincidence, maybe some tourist lost out here. But every time I took a turnoff, they took it too. When I finally reached the small town near the ranger station, I pulled into a diner parking lot, figuring I'd lose them in the lot traffic. The Lincoln slowed at the corner, stopped for a second, then rolled past without turning its headlamps on, even though dusk had started to set in. I watched it go until it disappeared around a bend. I told myself it was nothing. 2 days later, I got a call at my work cell from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was male but oddly flat, like someone reading from a script. He said, "Mr. Baxter, you were in Sector 12B on Monday, correct?" I didn't think anything of it. I assumed it was a higher-up checking on my report. But when I asked what department he was with, there was this pause. Then he said, "Verification purposes only," and hung up. That evening, I went back through my phone trying to find that number, but it wasn't listed in my recent calls. Just gone. A few days passed and things got stranger. I started finding my truck doors unlocked in the morning, even though I always lock them. Nothing inside was disturbed, nothing missing, just off. Then one night, I was closing up the maintenance shed around 9 when I noticed a pair of headlights parked by the fence line across the gravel lot. The same car, same black Lincoln. It sat there for almost 15 minutes, engine running, no one getting out. I finally walked toward it with a flashlight, shouting that the property was closed. The lights went out instantly, and by the time my eyes adjusted, it was gone. That night, around 2 in the morning, someone knocked on my door. 3 short knocks. When I looked through the peephole, 2 men were standing on the porch. Both wore black suits, white shirts, black ties. They weren't wearing hats, but their hair was cut short, identical styles, and they both had the same expression, polite, but not quite natural, like they were mimicking what a friendly smile should look like. The shorter one spoke first. His voice was calm, measured. "Mr. Baxter, we'd like to ask you a few questions about your field work." I asked who they were with. He glanced at the taller man before answering. "We're from the Department of Energy," he said. "Just to follow up on some activity in your area." I told them it was late and asked to see identification. Both of them reached into their jackets at the same time and held out black leather folders, but when I looked closer, there was nothing printed inside. Just blank plastic where a badge or ID should have been. I pointed that out, and the taller man said, "It's temporary." They asked if I'd noticed anything unusual in the last week. I said no, just trying to end the conversation. Then the shorter one tilted his head slightly and said, "You didn't record anything on your personal device?" Something about the way he said personal device stuck with me. Too formal, like English wasn't his first language, but not in an accent way. Just wrong somehow. When I said I hadn't, they both nodded at the same time. The shorter one added, "That's preferable. Thank you for cooperating." They turned together, walked back down my steps, and got into the same black Lincoln I'd seen before. I stood there listening until I heard the engine start. But when I looked down the road, the taillights were already gone. The next morning, I checked the door camera I'd installed a few years ago, one of those cheap motion-activated ones. It showed me opening the door, talking to empty air. No one else visible. I didn't sleep much after that. For the next few nights, I kept hearing what sounded like a low hum outside the house, like an electrical transformer, steady and distant, the kind of sound that seems to come from everywhere at once. My dog, Murphy, would lift his head and stare at the window but never bark. A week later, while driving out to another site near the dry lake, my radio cut out mid-song, just static. Then a voice broke through, faint, mechanical, saying my name. Not Mr. Baxter, just Evan. I pulled over, shut the truck off, and listened. The voice said one more thing, "You'll forget the details." Then silence. When I turned the ignition back on, the radio worked fine. The station was still playing, same signal strength. I checked my phone for reception, 4 bars. That was the last time I saw the Lincoln. But there were smaller things after that. A few coworkers mentioned surveyors asking about me at the ranger station. 2 men in suits. They apparently showed ID, said they were there to confirm environmental readings. No one could remember their names. The logbook where visitor info is recorded that week went missing. One morning about a month later, I found a small metal disc lying in the bed of my truck. It was smooth, no markings, about the size of a quarter. When I picked it up, it was warm, even though the truck had been parked overnight in 40-degree weather. I threw it out into the brush without thinking. Since then, I've tried to move on. Still work for the parks, though I avoid that sector now. Every once in a while, I'll spot a dark sedan on the highway behind me, but I can never be sure it's the same one. The desert's full of mirages and tricks of light. What I can't explain, though, is the file from that inspection trip. Every report I've ever done saves to the shared database automatically. That one doesn't exist anymore. The entry number skips from 218 to 220, as if 2 and 19 never happened. When I asked our admin about it, she said, "You didn't file a 2 and 19. You were off that day." I know I wasn't. I still have the sunburn from it. It started the day after I posted that video. I live just outside of Astoria, Oregon, near the coast. My place is small, one of those one-story houses with wood siding and a front porch that's always damp because of the fog. I work from home editing video for a marketing firm, so I'm up late most nights. A few weeks back, I was out back with my dog Milo when I noticed lights over the tree line behind my yard. They weren't airplanes. I know what those look like. You see them all the time here, heading toward Portland or Seattle. These were lower, brighter, and completely silent. They drifted in a line, then stopped dead. No movement, no noise, just hung there. Then one flickered out, then another, until there was only one left. That one dimmed slowly and vanished. I filmed about 40 seconds of it on my phone. You could see the lights pretty clearly. Shaky footage, but definitely visible. I didn't say anything in the video, I just zoomed in, held the shot, and ended the clip. I uploaded it to my personal channel later that night. It wasn't a big deal. I didn't tag it or put any crazy title on it. Just strange lights over Astoria, March 18th. By the next afternoon, it had around 1,000 views, which was weird because my channel barely had 50 followers. That night around 10, I noticed a black van parked across the street from my house. No logos, no plates that I could see, just sitting there with the lights off. I figured it belonged to someone visiting the neighbors. But when I looked again an hour later, it was still there. It was gone when I woke up. The next night, same thing. Around 9:30, it showed up again. Same spot. No lights, no movement. I turned off my living room lamp and watched through the window. It stayed until almost midnight. I didn't want to sound paranoid, so I didn't tell anyone right away. I just started paying attention. The third night, I took a photo through the blinds. All you could really see were the faint outlines of the van and the reflection of my own living room light. But still, proof it was there. Then it became routine. Every night for a week, it parked in the same place. Always between 9 and 10. Always left before dawn. I thought maybe it was a coincidence until I noticed something strange with the video. Around the fifth night, I checked my channel and saw the views had jumped again. Over 6,000. The comments were weird though. A bunch of them were identical. Just the same sentence, posted by different accounts. Take it down. I reported them as spam, but new ones kept showing up. That's when I started getting calls from unknown. No voicemail, just a single ring and hang up. On the seventh night, I decided to confront whoever it was. The van showed up just after 9:30, parked right across the street like always. The air was cold and damp and the fog was thicker than usual. I stood at my window for a while, then finally grabbed my jacket and went outside. Milo followed me onto the porch, growling low under his breath. When I stepped off the curb, the van's engine started. No headlights, just the sound of the motor kicking in. I walked toward it anyway, trying to see who was inside. The front windows were tinted too dark to make out anything. I was maybe 10 feet away when it pulled forward. Slow at first, then faster. It turned the corner and disappeared down the hill without turning its lights on. I didn't chase it. I just stood there, feeling stupid and uneasy. The street was completely silent again, except for Milo whining behind me. The next morning, my video was gone. At first, I thought maybe YouTube flagged it or something, but when I logged into my account, it said deleted by user. I hadn't touched it. When I checked the account activity, it showed the deletion came from a device signed in from a location in Nevada, a town I'd never heard of. I changed my passwords and enabled two-factor verification. It didn't make me feel any better. That afternoon, I called a friend, Kelly, who's good with tech stuff. She came over and looked at my laptop, said it didn't seem like a hack, more like someone had direct access. She asked if anyone else had my login info. I said no. She told me to check my security camera. I have a little one above the front door, the kind that uploads footage to the cloud. I pulled up the feed from the night before. It showed me walking out onto the porch, then stepping into the street. The van was there, faint outline under the streetlight. But right before it started moving, the footage glitched. Just a single skipped frame. In that missing frame, the van went from park to halfway down the street. No acceleration, no movement, just a jump. I replayed it a dozen times. Same thing. 1 second parked, next second gone. Kelly told me that can happen if the camera connection drops for a moment. I guess that's true. But I'd never seen it do that before. That night, I couldn't sleep. I left the blinds open a little and kept the front porch light on. Around 2 a.m., I saw headlights sweep across my living room wall, slow like a car idling past. I looked out and saw a black sedan, not the van this time. 2 men were inside. One of them turned his head toward my house as they passed. They didn't stop. I watched until they were out of sight. When I finally went to bed, Milo barked once in his sleep, this short, sharp sound that made my heart jump. 2 days later, a white envelope showed up in my mailbox. No return address. Inside was a printed photo, grainy, low-res, like it came from an old phone. It was a still from my own security camera footage, showing me standing in the street, looking at the van. Across the bottom, typed in small black letters, was one sentence. Curiosity is not a shield. I called the police then. They sent an officer, young guy, seemed skeptical but polite. I showed him the photo, the footage, told him about the van. He took notes and said they'd keep an eye out. I never heard back. The van didn't come again after that. For a while, I convinced myself it was all just some weird online prank. Maybe someone trying to mess with me after the video got traction. But a week later, I was driving to Safeway in town, and at the four-way intersection near the bridge, I saw that same black sedan waiting at the light across from me. The driver was staring straight ahead, hands on the wheel. The passenger turned his head just slightly and looked directly at me. He was wearing sunglasses, even though it was foggy. I tried to play it cool and looked down at my phone pretending to check something, but when I glanced back up, the light had turned green and the sedan was gone. That night, I checked my YouTube account again. It was still there, But when I clicked on the device history page, it showed another login attempt, blocked this time from somewhere in New Mexico. No IP, no device ID, just unknown. I haven't uploaded anything since. The phone calls stopped. No more vans or sedans parked outside. But every now and then, around the same time the van used to show up, the motion alert from my front camera pings. When I open the feed, there's nothing there, just the empty street and the faint reflection of my porch light in the wet pavement. Once, though, I caught a glimpse of something at the edge of the frame. Not a person. Not really. Just two dark shapes standing side by side for a second before the feed froze and skipped ahead. When it came back, the street was empty again, and the timestamp showed the footage had jumped ahead exactly 3 minutes. I saved that clip to a flash drive, but when I tried to play it later, it said the file was corrupted. I unplugged the camera after that. I keep it in a drawer now. I still live here. Things are normal, mostly. But every few weeks, I'll see a black car parked somewhere I don't expect. At the grocery store, by the post office, outside the diner near the docks. Always clean, always idling. I tell myself it's just a car. I get in mine, start the engine, and drive home. But when I pull into my driveway and step out, I always check across the street before going inside, just in case. I had been hiking in Joshua Tree for most of the day, carrying only a small pack with water, snacks, and my camera. The sky was the kind of deep, dry blue that makes the rocks pop, and the air was warm, but with that desert edge that bites if you stop moving. I was on a service road, one I'd picked because it was quiet and supposedly scenic, the kind you take if you want the feeling of being completely alone. I noticed the first SUV maybe half a mile down the road. It was black, the kind of paint that swallowed light, and it was parked crookedly against the rocks, tires half on sand, half on gravel. I didn't think much of it at first. Lots of hikers leave vehicles there, but when I got closer, I realized it wasn't just abandoned. There was no dust or sand on the windows, no keys left in the ignition, no papers inside. I thought it was strange, but shrugged it off. Maybe a ranger or someone working on a trail report. I kept walking. About a mile further, there was a second SUV. Identical black, parked the same way, windows clean, completely still. I slowed down, the dry wind brushing sand into my ankles. I stopped and watched. There was no one inside. I walked around each vehicle, looking for footprints, signs of anyone near, and there was nothing. No tracks leading away, nothing in the sand that looked recent except my own. I even circled the first SUV again, trying to see if I'd missed someone, but it was empty. I made a joke to myself, talking out loud to the desert air, saying something like, "Well, that's creepy." The sound of my own voice felt like it bounced back differently, somehow softer, like the rocks swallowed it. I moved on. I hiked the rest of the trail, keeping an eye on the horizon. Everything looked normal, except the weight of being watched started to creep in. My skin kept tingling, and I kept looking back along the road, but the SUVs didn't move. I tried to focus on the rocks and the shadows stretching over them. After a few hours, I reached my car. It was parked at the trailhead, my usual spot. I dropped my pack in the sand and stretched, finally letting my muscles relax. That's when I noticed something. There were footprints in the sand. Not mine. They were heavy, wide, and they led straight from the service road to where my car was parked. I froze. There was no one there. No movement, no shadow, no sound. Just footprints, fresh enough that the sand hadn't blown them over yet. I crouched to examine them. The prints were clean, deep, and evenly spaced, like someone had been walking steadily. My first thought was that maybe someone had walked by earlier, and I hadn't noticed. But the only other person on the road had been the SUVs, and if someone had come from that direction, they would have had to pass the first SUV, where I'd been walking around, or the second. I had seen nothing. No figure, no shadow. I backed away slowly and circled the car. The footprints stopped at the tires, like someone had walked straight up to the driver's side, but there was no door handle touched. No scuff on the paint, nothing. I checked inside quickly. Locked, empty, nothing disturbed. My pulse had picked up, the desert quiet, pressing down on me. I looked back down the service road. The SUVs were gone. I'd thought about running to check, but the road stretched for miles. No movement, no dust clouds, no trace of where they could have gone. It was like they had never been parked there at all, except for the first half mile of footprints that led straight to my car. I got in, locked the doors, and tried to shake it off. I told myself it was a trick of light or someone moving really fast on the trails, but the prints were too clear, too measured. I drove slowly back toward the main highway, glancing in the rearview mirror. Nothing. No vehicles following, no movement along the ridges. The drive back was tense. Every shadow along the rocks made me flinch. Every wind gust sounded like a footstep on gravel. My phone had spotty service, which didn't help. I tried calling a friend just to say something, anything, but no signal. The desert was too quiet, too open. When I got back to my apartment that evening, I checked the photos I had taken earlier. The SUVs appeared in the first few frames, parked exactly where I remembered. But then, in the last few before I reached my car, they weren't there. Not blurry, not half hidden, just gone. The footprints in the sand didn't appear in the photos at all. I called a ranger in the morning to ask if there had been any maintenance or patrols on that service road. Nothing. No reports of hikers, vehicles, or anyone out there. He asked if I was sure about the location, and I was. I'd taken a mental note of the rock formations, the bend in the road, the scrub, and Joshua trees. I went back a week later to see if there were any footprints, but the sand had been blown over. No traces, no signs of the SUVs, nothing unusual except the endless spread of rock and scrub. I don't know if it was someone playing a trick, some ranger patrol I didn't know about, or something else. I keep thinking about the way the SUVs just disappeared, and the way the footprints led right up to my car. Something about the timing and distance makes it impossible to be normal. I still hike out there sometimes, sticking to the main trails, but I avoid that service road. I tell friends about it in fragments like a story to entertain, but the images stay in my head. Black SUVs sitting like statues, perfectly still, and footprints that led to a car that no one had touched. It happened when I was still working at KQRC Channel 7 in Nebraska, a small-town news station that mostly covered farm reports, local fairs, and high school sports. This was about 5 years ago, in early November. Cold, windy nights, the kind where the static in your hair doesn't go away no matter what you do. We'd been running stories for a few days about some kind of light show over the Platte River. People calling in about bright orbs, hovering low, moving in ways planes don't. Normally, we'd laugh that stuff off, but there were so many calls this time that we sent a field reporter out. He came back with shaky footage of 3 lights darting in a triangle formation or fading behind the tree line. It wasn't great footage, but it was enough to make the 6 p.m. broadcast. That night, the phones lit up. People said they'd seen it too. Same lights, same time. The segment got picked up by a regional affiliate. It was one of the bigger reactions we'd had in months. The next morning, 2 men came into the station asking to speak to me. I was the evening anchor at the time. They introduced themselves as investigators with a federal aeronautics department. That's what one of them said, word for word. The name didn't sound official, but their tone was. Both of them wore black suits, white shirts, black ties, no coats, even though it was freezing outside. They were polite, but there was something off about them. They looked similar, same height, same build, same pale complexions. Their voices were flat, measured, like they'd practiced every word. The taller one did most of the talking. He said they were looking into unauthorized aerial phenomena and wanted to give a brief on-air statement that evening to clarify some misconceptions. That phrasing stuck with me. Unauthorized, not unidentified. Normally, we'd never let random people go live without confirming their credentials, but they had paperwork, real letterhead, signatures, even a contact number for a Washington, D.C. office. Our news director, Ben, checked it and said it seemed legit. So we slotted them for a quick segment during the 6 o'clock broadcast. They didn't want makeup, didn't need lighting adjustments. They just sat perfectly still while the tech crew prepped the set. At exactly 6:12 p.m., we went live. I introduced them as representatives from a federal agency investigating the recent lights. They both nodded at the same time. The taller one started speaking. He said the lights were part of a meteorological exercise involving high-altitude drones. He said that they posed no threat and that the testing phase had concluded. His voice never changed pitch or volume. He blinked exactly once every few sentences. The shorter man never spoke. He just watched me the whole time. Not the camera, not the monitors, me. We wrapped the segment early because something about it felt wrong. The answers didn't match the questions, like he was reciting something unrelated. When I thanked them for coming on, they both smiled at the same time. Small, stiff smiles that didn't reach their eyes. They left right after. No small talk, no questions for the producers. Just stood up, said, "Thank you for your cooperation," and walked out together into the dark parking lot. We aired the rest of the broadcast normally. After the show, I went home, poured a glass of wine, and turned on the replay we keep archived online. I like to review my segments sometimes just to check pacing or tone. The recording started fine. Local weather, a school board meeting, my introduction about the aerial sightings. Then right when it should have cut to the two men, the feed glitched. The video froze for about half a second, then jumped to static. The audio buzzed for maybe 5 seconds before it cut back in with me saying, "Thank you both for joining us." The entire interview, gone. At first I thought it was a streaming error, so I tried the internal backup system we keep on the station's drive. Same thing. I went back the next morning, before the morning crew arrived, and checked the raw broadcast feed. Static. Every single version of the recording, the live feed, the studio archive, the broadcast replay, all cut out at the same exact second. When the others came in, I asked if anyone had noticed. None of them remembered filming it. Not one. Ben, our news director, swore we'd never had two guests that night. He pulled up the broadcast schedule from the rundown system, and the segment block was blank, just labeled local interest filler. I thought maybe I was losing it until I found the index cards I'd written my questions on. They were still on my desk, with the taller man's name written across the top in my handwriting, Agent Barlow. I showed it to Ben. He said it wasn't possible because he'd been sitting in the control room all night and would have remembered scheduling something like that. He thought maybe I'd prepped it and it got cut before airtime. But I knew it happened. I remembered his voice, the way he said unauthorized. I asked our camera guy, Todd, if he remembered adjusting the shots for two guests. He frowned and said, "You only had one interview last night, the guy from the animal shelter." That's when I started to feel genuinely unsettled. I went to the lobby security camera footage. We keep a 24-hour recording system that loops every 2 days. I scrubbed back to that morning when the men had first arrived. I saw the front door open. Then, nothing. The footage jumped 5 seconds ahead. One frame empty, the next frame showing the door closing. No one visible entering or leaving. The same gap appeared when I checked the camera over the hallway leading to the studio. A 5-second skip where they should have been walking through. That afternoon, I called the DC number from the letter they'd shown us. A woman answered. When I mentioned the department's name, Federal Aeronautics Division, she paused for a long moment and said there was no such office. Then she hung up. I still had the paperwork they gave us, so I scanned it, planning to send it to a friend who worked in records at the state capitol. When I opened the file, the next morning, the scan was blank. Completely white. I went back to the paper copy, thinking maybe the scanner malfunctioned, but the ink was gone. The pages were still warm from the printer, but totally blank. That night, I got a call at home from a blocked number. I let it go to voicemail. When I played it back, it was 6 seconds of silence, then a voice saying, "Correction issued." Male voice. Calm, slow, slightly distorted. The next day, our entire segment about the lights over the river was pulled from the station website. No explanation, no note, just removed. Ben told us to move on, said we were dropping the story. For a while I did. We went back to covering weather reports and lost dogs. But small things started happening that I couldn't brush off. My car alarm would go off in the middle of the night. My mailbox would be half open in the morning, even when I hadn't used it. I started noticing a black sedan parked across from the station at odd hours, always clean, always empty. One night after work, around midnight, I saw it again. Same sedan, parked under a streetlight outside my apartment building. When I pulled in, its headlights flicked on, then off. It didn't move, just idled for a minute before driving away slow. I told myself it was just nerves. A week later, I came in early to prep the teleprompter and found a single envelope on my desk. No name, no postage, just plain white paper. Inside was a photo, me, sitting behind the anchor desk. Not a still from a broadcast, but a candid shot, slightly tilted, like it was taken from behind one of the studio cameras. On the back, in faint black type, it said, "Do not record unauthorized subjects." I turned it over and over, trying to understand how anyone could have taken it. The studio's cameras don't take stills, and no one had been there that morning except me. I didn't show anyone. I just put the photo in my bag and left it there. A few weeks later, I gave notice and moved out of state. I told everyone I just wanted a change, something new. But sometimes I wake up at 6:12 a.m., same time that segment aired, and my TV will be on, static filling the screen. I don't have cable anymore. I was living outside of Sedona at the time, a small rental cabin near Oak Creek, just off one of those dirt roads where GPS barely works and cell service drops out after a few bends. It wasn't anything fancy, just one room, a wood stove, and a tiny kitchen. I was working remote and spent most evenings hiking the canyons after work. This happened in late August, around 8 p.m. Still warm, but the sun had dipped low enough that the air had that dry, cool smell you only get in the desert. I'd taken my usual route along Cathedral Trail, just me and my camera. I liked shooting time lapses of sunsets. I wasn't some influencer or anything, it was just a hobby. Halfway through the trail, there's a lookout point that faces east across a canyon. That's where I saw it. It started as a single bright light, moving too fast to be slow a plane, but too slow to be a meteor. I figured maybe it was a drone, but it was high. Way above where you'd fly one. It changed direction 3 times in under a minute. I pulled out my phone and started recording. It moved in these sharp, deliberate angles, like someone dragging a cursor across the sky. Then it just stopped, completely still for about 5 seconds, and shot straight upward until it vanished. I stood there a while waiting for it to come back, but the sky was empty again. When I got home, I uploaded the clip to my laptop. The video was grainy, but you could still see it, that weird, perfect motion. I posted it on a hiking forum I use sometimes, just to see if anyone else had seen it. I didn't put my full name, no address, nothing that could trace back to me. Just saw this above Oak Creek tonight. Anyone know what it is? The post got a few comments before I went to bed. Mostly jokes, 1 or 2 people saying satellite flare or drone swarm. I didn't think much more about it. Around 7:30 the next morning, I heard someone knock on the cabin door. I almost didn't answer because no one ever came out there. The mailman left packages by the gate and I didn't really have neighbors, but the knocking came again, steady and slow. When I opened the door, there were 2 men standing there, both in black suits, white shirts, black ties. It looked wrong against the red dirt and sun-bleached trees. Their shoes were spotless, not a speck of dust on them. The taller one smiled and said, "Good morning, Mr. Heller. We're with the Department of Atmospheric Studies. May we come in for a moment?" Heller's my last name, but I never used it online. I hadn't told anyone about the video except for the post. I asked how they found me, and the shorter one said, "Your post was flagged for review. We're just conducting some follow-up." His voice was quiet but clipped, like he was reading from a script. They didn't wait for an invitation. They just stepped inside, both of them moving in perfect sync. The taller one glanced around the room, eyes flicking over the laptop, the camera bag, the unwashed dishes in the sink. The other one stayed by the door, hands folded in front of him. The tall one asked to see the footage. I said sure, figuring it couldn't hurt. I pulled it up on the laptop and pressed play. He leaned in close, watching every second. When the light shot upward and disappeared, he paused it and stared at the frozen frame. Then he asked, "You didn't see any ground reflection? Any audible disturbance?" I said no. He nodded, turned toward his partner, and said, "Local atmospheric inversion, as expected." The shorter one gave a single nod, no expression. Then the tall one closed the laptop himself, slowly, like he was handling something fragile, and said, "We'll be taking this for review." I told him he couldn't just take my laptop. He smiled again, that same small, tight smile, and said, "We'll return it promptly once it's cleared." I didn't argue. Something about both of them felt wrong. Not threatening exactly, but heavy, like the air in the room had changed. They thanked me for my cooperation, turned, and walked out. Their black sedan was parked at the end of the dirt drive, spotless despite the dust. They got in and drove away slow, without leaving a single tire mark in the sand. When I checked my watch, it had stopped. The second hand was frozen at 8:42, the exact time I realized when the light had vanished the night before. I tried winding it, shaking it, nothing. I figured maybe it just died, so I set it on the counter and forgot about it. The rest of that day felt off. I kept thinking I heard a car outside or voices down by the creek, but every time I checked, there was nothing. That night, I noticed something else. The video file was gone from my phone, too. Not just deleted. Gone, like it had never existed. Even the upload link from the forum was dead. When I tried to open the post, I got a blank page. The next morning, I drove into town to see if the library computers still had my forum post cached. Nothing. It was like it had never been posted. When I got home that afternoon, the laptop was sitting on my porch. No note, no explanation. It was wiped completely clean. New system install, empty hard drive. I decided not to go hiking for a while. 2 nights later, I woke up around 3 a.m. to a sound outside. Not loud, but steady, like a low hum, somewhere between an engine and a power line. It pulsed, soft and rhythmic. I looked out the window, and down the trail that runs behind the cabin, I saw 2 faint figures standing side by side. No flashlights, no movement, just standing there. I watched for maybe a full minute, but they never moved or turned toward me. The sound faded, and when I blinked, they were gone. The next morning, I checked the dirt around the trail. No footprints, no tire marks. That same day, I noticed my watch had started ticking again, same time it stopped before, 8:42. Except now the date had reset itself to August 18th, 1 day earlier than it actually was. I didn't wear it after that. A week later, I finally talked myself into going for another hike. I brought a different camera, one that wasn't connected to my phone or laptop. I didn't see any lights, but halfway up the trail, I found something half buried in the dirt, a small black card, smooth and blank, like a hotel key card. When I picked it up, it was warm to the touch, even though the sun hadn't hit that side of the canyon yet. I left it there. When I got back that night, the clock on my stove was blinking, like the power had gone out, except none of the other appliances were affected. The time flashing on it was 8:42. After that, I started noticing small changes I couldn't explain. My phone's location services would turn on by itself. The porch light would flicker exactly 3 times every night around the same hour. Once, when I was driving back from town, I saw a black sedan parked off the highway shoulder near the turnoff to my road. The windows were tinted. 2 silhouettes sat inside, facing straight ahead. When I passed them, they didn't move. A week after that, a package showed up in my mailbox. No return address, no postage, just a plain box. Inside was my old watch, the one I'd left on the counter weeks earlier. It was ticking again. The second hand was moving backwards. I moved out of the cabin before the lease was up. Left most of my stuff behind. Camera, furniture, the laptop they'd given back. I don't even hike anymore. But the weirdest part came months later. I was staying with my sister near Flagstaff, helping her with her kids. One night she called me into the living room and said, "Hey, weren't you the one who posted that UFO video last summer? Someone on YouTube's talking about it." She showed me her phone. It was my clip. Same canyon, same night sky, same light darting and stopping. But the voice narrating it wasn't mine. It was someone else describing what they saw, word for word the way I'd written my original post. The upload date said August 17th, 1 day before I even filmed it. I was in Caledonia, a small town in upstate New York, doing research for a local history project. The library there is one of those older stone buildings with creaky floors and that constant faint smell of dust and paper. It was early November, late afternoon, gray sky outside, the kind of day that feels like it's been dusk since noon. I wasn't researching anything weird, at least not at first. I was looking into regional folklore for a podcast idea. Local legends, ghost stories, old missing person cases, stuff people tend to tell over beers but never write down. That's how I ended up finding a stack of microfilm labeled Livingston County Press, 1950 to 1960. Halfway through scrolling, I came across a small article. Strange lights reported over Canaseraga. It was from May 1954. It mentioned a farmer named Elmer Rhodes who saw a bright orange object hovering above his field, followed by several neighbors reporting an unusual buzzing sound. Pretty standard UFO era story. What caught my attention was the follow-up 2 weeks later, a correction note saying Mr. Rhodes had recanted his statement and acknowledged the error of his observations. The phrasing was stiff, almost forced. Curious, I searched for more mentions. There weren't any. But there was another small article a month later, this one about a government inspection of the same farmland. No details, just that 2 representatives had interviewed residents and found no evidence of aerial phenomena. I printed both and asked the librarian, a woman named Patty, if the town ever digitized police records from that era. She said no, but the archives room had some old ledgers. She led me to a back section behind a set of frosted glass doors, a narrow hallway lined with filing cabinets and those buzzing fluorescent lights that hum just enough to make you notice. I was back there for maybe an hour, flipping through handwritten reports from the 50s. Most of it was mundane, livestock complaints, vandalism, noise disturbances. Then I found one dated May 12, 1954. Unidentified lights, possible aircraft, West Ridge near Rhodes' property. The report ended abruptly. No signature. It just stopped mid-sentence. Subject interviewed by federal, and then nothing. That's when I heard it, the faint sound of shoes on the tile behind me. I turned around, expecting Patty. 2 men stood in the doorway. They were both tall, pale, dressed identically. Black suits, white shirts, thin black ties. No coats despite the cold. They didn't look like anyone I'd ever seen around town. The one on the left spoke first. His voice was clear but off somehow, like each word had been carefully chosen. "Why are you looking into what does not exist?" I thought maybe they were joking. I said, "Excuse me?" The other man took a small step forward and repeated it exactly, same cadence, same tone. "Why are you looking into what does not exist?" It was the way they said it that got to me. Not angry, not curious, just flat. Like reading from a teleprompter. I asked who they were with. The taller one tilted his head slightly, almost mechanical, and said, "We are only observers." I laughed a little, trying to cut the tension. "Observers from where?" They both smiled, at the exact same moment. Not similar smiles, the same smile. Their lips moved in sync, same angle, same number of teeth showing. It was like watching a reflection, except they weren't identical. One had a slightly darker complexion, maybe Mediterranean, but the expressions matched perfectly. They didn't blink. I started to feel this weird pressure in my ears, like before a thunderstorm. The hum from the fluorescent lights seemed louder, vibrating through the floor. I said something like, "If you guys are with some agency, you should probably talk to the librarian," but they both turned simultaneously and walked out. No hesitation, no goodbye. By the time I stepped into the main library room, they were gone. The glass front doors were still swinging slightly, like they'd just left. Patty looked up from her desk. I asked if she'd seen 2 men walk out. She said, "No, just you." I told her there had been 2 guys in suits in the archive hallway. She looked confused and said the only other person in the building that day was her assistant, who'd left an hour ago. I walked outside to the parking lot. The only car there besides mine was an old beige Buick that had been there when I arrived. I stood there for a minute, trying to figure out what just happened, when I noticed something odd. It wasn't just quiet, it was too quiet. The kind of silence that makes your brain strain for background noise. Even the wind had stopped. I got in my car and started it, just to hear something normal. When I looked in the rearview mirror, for a split second I thought I saw them standing at the far end of the lot, 2 dark shapes near the edge of the trees. But when I turned around, there was nothing. I told myself it was a trick of the light. Drove home, tried to forget about it. That night, I took out the microfilm printouts I'd made earlier. The ink on the second article, the one about the government inspection, had smudged completely. Just a blank rectangle where the text had been. The first one, the farmer's report, was still legible. Except now there was a faint shadow printed across it, like a reflection of a face. 2 blurred ovals where eyes would be. The next day I went back to the library to ask Patty if she'd seen those men again. She said no, and then added, But someone came in right after you left yesterday asking for the same microfilm reels. I asked what they looked like. She said, I don't know. I didn't really look up. They sounded strange, like they were using a speakerphone. I asked if she still had the reels. She checked the cabinet, frowned, and said, That's odd. The whole box is gone. A week later, I started noticing a black sedan parked across from my apartment. Not every day, just often enough that it felt deliberate. Sometimes it was there in the morning, sometimes after sunset. No plates on the front, tinted windows. Once, around 9 p.m., I walked past it on my way to take out the trash. I glanced through the windshield. 2 figures sat inside, not moving. When I stepped closer, the engine started without a sound, and the car pulled away. Slow, not hurried. After that, I kept the curtains closed. 2 nights later, I woke up to a knock on my door. 3 soft taps. I looked through the peephole. No one. I didn't open it. The next morning, I found a folded piece of paper on my welcome mat. No handwriting, no message, just a small printed phrase in all caps. There is nothing to find. That same day, my access card for the university library stopped working. When I called the admin office, they said my credentials had been temporarily deactivated pending verification. No one could tell me why. I tried logging into my podcast's email account. Password didn't work. The recovery number had been changed to one I didn't recognize. By then, I was paranoid enough to start thinking I'd done something illegal without realizing it. I even called the local police station, asked if anyone had filed a complaint against me. The officer checked and said no, but added, "You're not the first to ask something like that lately." 2 weeks after that, I went back to Caledonia to clear my head. Drove past the library. It was closed for maintenance. Windows covered with brown paper. When I got home that night, there was a voicemail on my landline, a number I didn't know. It was a man's voice, perfectly clear, no background noise. He said, "Mr. Heller, you are no longer required to continue your research. We appreciate your attention." Then silence for about 10 seconds before the line clicked off. I saved the message and tried to play it again later that evening, but it was gone. Not deleted. Gone. My phone log didn't even show the call. A few months passed. Things went back to normal. I moved, changed numbers, didn't mention the story to anyone. Then one afternoon, while cleaning out a box of old papers, I found a slip of library receipt paper I don't remember keeping. The timestamp said November 8th, 4:13 p.m., the day I'd been in Caledonia. Under Checked Out was just one title, Atmospheric Studies, Volume 3. I don't recall ever touching that book. But under librarian initials, in small, careful letters, someone had written, "Oh." I got into podcasting as a hobby during the pandemic. I worked nights at a small AM station in Dayton, Ohio, and started a side project called Open Skies Radio. Just me talking with people who'd seen weird stuff, UFOs, lights, military cover-ups, that kind of thing. I never thought it'd go anywhere, but by last year it had a small following. Maybe a few thousand regular listeners. Nothing huge, but enough to get the attention of some interesting guests. One of them was a retired Air Force mechanic named Raymond. He'd worked at Wright Pat in the late 80s and claimed he saw something stored in a hangar, something he said wasn't an aircraft. His voice shook when he told me about it. I didn't press him too hard, just asked when and where. He said a few dates, mentioned a few people by name. The episode went live on a Thursday. By Saturday, the download numbers were higher than anything I'd ever posted. That same Saturday night, around 11:40, I got a call while editing another show. The caller ID just said, unknown. I almost ignored it, but I was expecting my co-host to call about scheduling, so I picked up. There was a pause, just faint background hiss. Then a man's voice came through, flat, deep, and slow. "Stop discussing that subject." At first I thought it was a prank. I said, "Who is this?" Another pause. Then, "Stop now." I laughed, mostly out of nerves, but he didn't say anything else. I hung up after maybe 20 seconds. When I checked my phone log, there was nothing. No number, no call duration, just a blank spot where it should have been. I tried redialing, but nothing happened. A few minutes later, my studio lights flickered. I was working in my apartment's spare bedroom, using a condenser mic, mixer, and an older Dell laptop. The lights dimmed twice, like a brownout. Then the fan in my laptop revved up for no reason. The mouse froze for a second. I told myself it was just a voltage dip. Happens sometimes when the heat kicks on. I went back to editing, but every time I hit play on Raymond's recording, there was this faint noise under his voice. Not feedback, not white noise, more like whispering. At first, I thought maybe it was my own voice bleed from the other track, but when I soloed the file, it was still there, right beneath the floor of his audio. It almost sounded like words, just too quiet to make out. I texted my co-host Eric and told him something weird was going on. He said maybe I'd corrupted the file exporting it. So I pulled the raw version from the SD card I'd used in my recorder. Same noise. I went to bed a little uneasy, but figured it was just a tech issue. The next morning, I woke up to my laptop fan running full blast. The lid was closed, but the screen was glowing faintly. When I opened it, every audio file I'd recorded in the last month was open in separate media player windows. Dozens of them. Each was playing simultaneously, all with that whispering undercurrent. It was quiet, just low static, but overlapping itself in this weird pulsing rhythm. I shut the lid and unplugged it. That afternoon, I went to work at the station. I mentioned the call to my boss, joking about getting threatened by the men in black. He didn't laugh. He just said, maybe don't poke around that stuff too much. The thing is, he used to work for the same Air Force base Raymond did. When I got home that evening, I noticed a black sedan parked across from my building. I live on a dead-end street, mostly retirees, not much traffic. The car was spotless, windows tinted. 2 guys sat inside, not talking, not moving. Both wearing black suits, white shirts. No plates on the front bumper, which stood out because Ohio requires them. I stood at my window watching for a few minutes. They didn't do anything, just sat there. Eventually, I convinced myself it was a coincidence and went to take a shower. When I came back 15 minutes later, the car was gone. Around 9, there was a knock at my door. I looked through the peephole and saw 2 men standing in the hallway, same suits. One taller, maybe 6 feet, clean-shaven with slick black hair. The other shorter, thin, bald, both wearing matching ties. The taller one spoke first. "Mr. Lang?" I said yes through the door. He nodded once, like confirming it to himself. "We'd like to ask you a few questions about a recording you made." His voice sounded off, like he was reading the words phonetically. No accent, just unnatural pacing. I said, "Who are you with?" The shorter one answered, "We represent an agency concerned with the dissemination of false information." He smiled when he said it, but his face didn't really match the smile. Like his mouth moved, but his eyes didn't. I told them I wasn't letting anyone in without ID. The taller one reached into his jacket and showed what looked like a badge, but from where I stood, I couldn't make out any details. Just a flash of silver and plastic. Then he said something that made me stop breathing for a second. "You have been warned once." I hadn't told anyone about the phone call except Eric and my boss. I said, "You need to leave." The 2 men looked at each other, then both smiled at exactly the same time, same angle, same movement. It looked rehearsed. Then they turned and walked down the hall without another word. I listened as their footsteps faded down the stairwell. When I peeked out the window again, that black sedan was parked back on the street. I couldn't see inside because of the tint. I called Eric. He told me to get my stuff and stay at his place for the night. I grabbed my laptop, hard drives, and a backpack. But when I tried to export my project files, the computer froze. The screen turned black except for one line of text across the middle. "Stop!" I powered it down and left. Eric lived about 20 minutes away in Huber Heights. On the drive there, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror a few times. Same spacing, same brightness. When I changed lanes, they changed too. I made a few random turns off the main road. The car stayed back, never speeding or dropping. When I pulled into Eric's driveway, the headlights slowed and turned off about a block away. I ran inside. He thought I was exaggerating until we went outside together 10 minutes later. There was nothing there, just quiet, suburban, dark, and wet pavement. We stayed up late, trying to open my files again on his computer. Every single one of them, dozens of hours of interviews, was replaced with static. Some clips had fragments of voices under it, low and garbled. But when we tried to boost the audio, the waveforms flattened like they'd been scrubbed. Around 3 a.m., Eric's power flickered. His router reset. His phone buzzed with an unknown notification and froze. He said maybe the storm was interfering. It had started raining lightly, but the timing felt too neat. The next morning, when I drove back home, the black sedan was gone. But there were two wet boot prints on my front doormat, side by side, perfectly even. No muddy trail leading to or from them, just those two. I threw the mat away. For a week after, I didn't sleep right. My phone would ring once or twice in the middle of the night, always showing unknown. When I answered, it was silent. My mail was tampered with twice, letters opened and resealed. I stopped the podcast soon after, told listeners I was taking a break for personal reasons. About a month later, I decided to check the backup cloud folder I'd forgotten about. Every file name was there, but when I tried to download them, they all came through blank, just 0-byte placeholders. The only thing left was one 5-second clip labeled intro.wave. It was just static, then a voice saying my name in that same flat tone. That's when I noticed something else. My phone's clock was off by exactly 13 minutes, and when I reset it, it jumped back again, right to the timestamp of that first call. It was a little after 6 on a foggy March morning when I first noticed the tracks. I was heading out to feed the cattle, same as I did every day. My place is about 15 miles east of Springfield, Missouri, 120 acres of mixed pasture and woods. I've been there most of my life, inherited the land from my dad. Nothing much ever happens out here except the occasional coyote or drunk teenager knocking down a fence post. The night before, there'd been some talk around town about lights over the ridge. A few folks said they saw bright flashes near Route D, white and green, silent, moving too fast to be a plane. I didn't see anything myself, though when I went out to check the barn around 10, I noticed the sky had this dull glow, like lightning behind clouds, except there wasn't any storm. Anyway, that morning the fog was thick, hanging low over the field. When I came around the side of the barn, I saw the tracks. They weren't mine. I drive an old Silverado, and these were way narrower, with a deep, clean tread like a government SUV. They came in off the back road, cut straight across the north pasture, and stopped near the fence line that backs up to the creek. I followed them out, thinking maybe a delivery truck had gotten turned around. But the grass out there is soft this time of year, and I could tell by the marks the vehicle must have come through late at night. The ground was still wet and shiny where the tires had pressed down. That's when I saw them, two men standing by the fence, both wearing black suits, white shirts, black ties. The fog made them look out of place, like cutouts pasted onto the scene. They had what looked like metal rods or tools, maybe a foot long, and they were crouched down, poking at the soil. I stopped about 30 yards away and called out, "Morning. Can I help you with something?" Both of them turned at the same time. Not startled, just synchronized. One of them, a tall guy with pale skin and slicked back hair, stood up straight and held a small metal case in front of him. "Good morning, sir. We're with the Department of Agriculture." His voice was deep, almost too even, like he'd practiced the line. "We're collecting environmental samples. Nothing to be concerned about." I asked if they had any paperwork, since I'd never heard of anyone from the Department of Agriculture showing up unannounced. The other one, shorter, older looking, wearing dark sunglasses even though the sun hadn't broken through the fog, said, "We're conducting a preliminary survey related to atmospheric conditions. Standard procedure." They didn't have any badges visible, no decals on the vehicle I could see. I looked around for their truck, but didn't see one. Just the tracks that led straight to where they were standing. I told them I'd have to call the sheriff before I let anyone collect samples off my land. The tall one smiled, but it didn't look right. His mouth moved, but the rest of his face stayed stiff. "That won't be necessary, Mr. Rains." That stopped me. I hadn't told them my name. It wasn't on any mailbox nearby either. I keep that out by the main road half a mile up. "Do I know you?" I asked. The shorter one stepped forward just a bit. "We're aware of your property," he said. "We'll only be a moment longer." Then he crouched again and pressed the tip of one of those metal rods into the dirt. It made a faint humming sound, like a power line in the wind. I couldn't tell if it was the tool or something else. I decided right then to go inside and call Sheriff Malone. I figured if they were legit, no harm done. If not, someone needed to check them out. The walk back to the house took maybe 5 minutes. The fog had thinned just enough that I could see the outline of the barn behind me, and both men were still there when I glanced over my shoulder. One crouched, one standing perfectly still, watching me leave. I called the sheriff's office from the kitchen phone. Dispatch said he was already out on a call but would head my way when he finished. Maybe 15 minutes tops. When I got back outside, the fog had lifted more, and the pasture was empty. No men, no vehicle, no sound except the wind through the trees. I walked all the way back to where they'd been standing. The tire tracks ended right there and didn't continue past the fence. There were no footprints, no sign of where they'd gone. I knelt down where I'd seen them taking samples. The ground was dry there, too dry. The morning dew covered everything else, but that patch of dirt was bone dust dry, like it had been baked. Sheriff Malone showed up about 10 minutes later in his cruiser. He's a good man, been in the county 30 years. I told him what I'd seen, showed him the tracks, told him about the men in suits. He asked what kind of tools they were using, and I described those metal rods. He looked around, hands on his hips, and said, "Well, they sure left in a hurry." Then he stopped and frowned. "Where'd they come in from?" I pointed toward the road. He walked the length of the tracks, following them back toward the fence. But about halfway there, he stopped. The prints didn't lead all the way out to the road. They just faded into the grass like the vehicle had lifted off the ground. He gave me a look like he didn't want to say what he was thinking. "You're sure you didn't see which direction they went?" I told him no. He shrugged and said he'd make a note of it, but there wasn't much else he could do. That afternoon, I went back out with a shovel to see if I could find anything in the soil where they'd been digging. A few inches down, I hit something hard, smooth, flat, metallic. It wasn't big, maybe the size of a credit card, and buried completely level. When I pulled it up, it wasn't a piece of machinery or scrap metal. It looked like brushed silver, with no markings, no screws or seams. Just a perfectly smooth, cold rectangle. When I brought it inside, my radio, an old AM/FM I keep on the counter, started hissing with static. It didn't matter what station I tuned to, just that same soft hiss with faint popping sounds underneath. I set the metal piece down and the static stopped. Picked it up again, and it started. By sunset, I'd talked myself out of it being anything special. Probably some kind of sensor or junk from the power company. I put it in my shed, closed the door, and tried not to think about it. That night, around midnight, my dogs started barking like crazy. I got up and looked out the back window. There was a glow over the pasture, a pale white light moving low to the ground. It wasn't a spotlight, didn't swing or flicker, just glided silently for a few seconds, then vanished. The next morning, I went to check the shed. The padlock was unlatched, hanging open. The metal piece was gone. No sign of footprints this time, not even mine. I could have sworn I'd locked it. When the sheriff came by later that week to follow up, I told him about the missing object. He looked around, wrote a few notes, and said he'd ask around at the local utility office. 2 days later, he called and said nobody from any agency, agricultural or otherwise, had been in the area that week. About a month later, I ran into him at the feed store. He mentioned kind of offhand that someone from the state had stopped by the station asking about the incident. 2 men said they were checking up on the report. He said he couldn't remember their names. I asked what they looked like. He thought for a second, then said, both of them wearing suits. Black, I think. Then he hesitated. Funny thing, though. They didn't drive up. They were already waiting in the parking lot when I got back from lunch. He didn't say much else after that. I haven't seen any strange lights since, and no more tracks in the pasture. But sometimes, early in the morning when the fog's still low, I think I can see faint lines pressed into the grass out by the fence, like something heavy sat there once and then disappeared without leaving a mark. It happened on a Tuesday evening in early November. I was heading home from work on the Route 217 bus that runs from downtown Portland out toward Tigard. It was already dark by 5:05, that heavy kind of darkness that settles early when the air smells like rain and everything feels half asleep. The bus was half full. A couple of high school kids, an older woman with groceries, one guy in a construction vest scrolling on his phone. I had my earbuds in but wasn't really listening to anything. Around the edge of town, where the route passes a patch of trees near Fano Creek, I looked out the window and saw this light moving above the tree line. It wasn't like a plane or a helicopter. It was smaller and closer, maybe a couple 100 feet up. No sound, no flashing markers. It darted left, stopped, then shot straight up like it was yanked on a string. It stayed there for maybe 3 seconds before it just went out. Not faded, went out like someone flipped a switch. A few people on the bus were looking too. I saw the older woman lean closer to the window. The guy in the vest pointed and said something to the driver, who didn't even slow down. Nobody said much after that. The rest of the ride was quiet. I got off at my usual stop near 99W and walked home. The next morning was gray and wet, typical Oregon winter weather. I took the same bus, same time, same stop. When I got on, two men were sitting together near the back. They were both wearing black suits, not coats, not rain jackets, actual suits with black ties and white shirts. No hats, no umbrellas, no briefcases. Both had pale skin, short dark hair, and the same sort of build. Average, but stiff, like they weren't used to sitting still. At first, I thought maybe they were co-workers or detectives or something, but there was something off about them. Their suits looked too crisp, like they'd just come from the tailor, but the collars were slightly uneven, like they didn't know how to wear them. Neither one moved or spoke. They just stared straight ahead, eyes fixed on the same point somewhere near the front of the bus. I sat a few rows ahead of them, trying not to stare. Every time I glanced back, they were in the same exact position, not talking, not checking their phones. When the bus stopped for passengers, they didn't turn their heads. They didn't even blink as far as I could tell. I remember thinking maybe they were part of some performance art thing, or maybe undercover transit security, but that didn't make sense either. No badges, no radios. When the bus got to my stop near the hospital, I stood up and walked toward the door. As I passed them, I noticed both were wearing identical black shoes, polished, spotless, no visible brand or stitching. I didn't think much of it until I stepped off and realized they'd stood up too. I glanced back through the window as the bus pulled away. They were standing in the aisle facing the door, not looking out, just standing like they were waiting for something. I started walking toward work. Halfway down the block, I heard the hiss of the bus pulling away behind me. Then footsteps. Slow, steady, like someone matching my pace about half a block back. I turned once, quickly. No one there. The sidewalk was empty. That whole day, I felt off, like something was sitting just behind my shoulder. Every time the automatic door opened in the office, I half expected to see them walk in. That evening, I took an Uber home instead of the bus. I didn't tell anyone why. I just said it was raining too hard. When I got to my stop, I looked down the street and saw two black sedans parked about 50 feet apart on opposite sides of the road, both running, headlights on. Nobody inside that I could see. I went inside, locked the door, and sat for a while without turning on the lights. The next morning, I told myself I'd imagined the whole thing. I took a later bus, thinking maybe the timing would be different. But when it pulled up, there they were again. Back row, same seats, same suits. I froze for a second before getting on. The driver looked at me like I was taking too long, so I forced myself to sit near the middle. The two men didn't move, didn't look at me, didn't look at anyone. About 10 minutes into the ride, the bus hit a stoplight near a construction zone. I looked back again. Both of them had turned their heads slightly, in unison, toward my side of the bus. Not directly at me, just angled, the same degree, same motion. Then, when the light turned green, they faced forward again. No one else seemed to notice. When I got to my stop, I got off quickly and started walking fast toward the corner. I wanted to turn and see if they followed, but was scared to make it obvious. At the next crosswalk, I risked a glance over my shoulder. They weren't there. The bus was already pulling away. I scanned the sidewalk, the shops, the parking lot. Nothing. They were gone. I didn't see them again for a few days, but strange things started happening after that. One morning, I found my back gate unlatched, even though I always keep it locked. Another night, my motion sensor light kept flickering on, even though there was no wind and no movement. Then, one evening, I came home and found a business card tucked into the crack of my front door. No name, no logo, just a plain white card with a phone number printed in black ink. The number had a local area code, but nothing else. I didn't call it. I threw it in the trash and tried to forget about it. 2 nights later, around 11 p.m., someone knocked on my door. 3 short knocks. When I looked through the peephole, no one was there. My front yard was empty, the street quiet. But as I turned away, I saw the faint reflection of headlights moving slowly past my house, then stopping for a few seconds before driving off. I slept with the light on after that. About a week later, I was waiting for the bus again, trying to convince myself I was just overreacting. The morning was foggy, visibility maybe 30 feet. When the bus pulled up, it was almost empty, except for 2 people sitting in the back. Same suits, same blank faces. I stepped back, pretending to check my phone, and let the bus leave without me. The driver honked once, annoyed, but I couldn't move. I stood there until the sound of the engine faded into the fog. I called in sick that day and walked home. No cars followed. No strange notes, no knocks, just quiet. Since then, I've switched routes. I drive more often now. Haven't seen them again, but I still check the rearview mirror when I stop at lights, half expecting to see those 2 faces reflected behind me, still expressionless, waiting. And sometimes, when the weather turns foggy in the mornings, I catch myself staring at the tree line along 99W, watching for that same darting light. It never shows up, but I can't stop looking. I was driving out to the old Watkins airstrip just after sunset. It's one of those tiny private strips, mostly abandoned, northeast of Sedalia, Missouri. No lights, nothing but cracked asphalt and a couple of hangars that look like they've been empty since the 80s. I was on my way to take pictures for a small aviation blog I write, just the usual stuff. That night, the sky was unusually clear, cold March air, the kind that makes the wind feel sharper against your cheeks. I pulled onto the gravel driveway leading to the strip and noticed something hovering above the far end of the tarmac. At first, I thought it was a crop duster pilot practicing, but there was no sound. None. Not even the faint hum of engines. The object didn't look like anything I recognized. Sort of dark, angular, maybe the size of a Cessna. It just stayed in place, perfectly still, no navigation lights, nothing. I sat in my truck for a minute, trying to convince myself it was a weather balloon or a reflection of some sort. Then it moved, slow and deliberate, parallel to the runway before disappearing behind the trees at the edge of the property. I grabbed my phone and called the Sedalia police non-emergency line to report it. The dispatcher seemed polite enough, but sounded skeptical. I gave her a description, my location, and mentioned it was hovering silently. She said someone would note the report, and that was it. I didn't think much of it after that, except I kept looking over my shoulder on the way back to town. The road was dark and mostly empty, just a few farmhouses. A couple of deer grazing near the edge of the fields. The next morning, I was driving to work in Jefferson City. I work in IT at a small insurance office, standard 9 to 5. About halfway there, I noticed a black sedan on the opposite side of the highway, roughly a quarter mile behind me. Nothing odd in itself until I noticed it was keeping pace exactly, staying in my lane whenever I changed. Then another black sedan appeared, tailing me in a different lane, same spacing. I tried slowing down, speeding up, even taking a detour through a side road. Both cars stayed behind me, never turning their heads, never making a signal, just moving. I called the office and told my coworker I might be late, trying not to sound panicked. Both cars stayed behind me until I pulled into the parking lot. When I parked, they stopped at the end of the lot for a moment, engines idling, then slowly drove away, parallel, without looking at anyone else in the lot. I spent the day trying to focus on work, but every glance out the window made me check the parking lot, the street, anywhere I could see. Nothing. No cars. No one watching. Just the normal suburban quiet. After work, I drove home a different route, this just to be cautious. About 10 miles from my house, I noticed a piece of paper tucked under the windshield wiper of my truck. I pulled over and unfolded it. The note was typed on a small piece of printer paper. You didn't see anything. No signature, nothing else. Just those 4 words in all caps. My hands shook a little as I read it. I looked around, empty street, houses dark, nothing moving. I stuck the note in my pocket and got home, locking the doors behind me. That night, I kept my truck in the garage. I couldn't sleep, kept thinking about the black sedans, the way the drivers never looked, the way they'd seemed to know I'd called the police. Around 2 a.m., I thought I heard tires on gravel, but when I looked out the window, nothing was there. The faint impression of headlights on my garage door, but gone as soon as I blinked. I tried to rationalize everything. Maybe it was some government surveillance or local law enforcement taking my report seriously. But no badge, no identification, just those two cars and that note. And why warn me after the fact instead of showing up at the airstrip themselves? The next morning, I drove past the airstrip again on my way to work. Nothing, just cracked asphalt, broken fencing, the hangars sagging, no trace of the object. I checked the surrounding fields for tire tracks or footprints. Nothing out of place. Over the next few days, I kept an eye on my route to work. No cars followed me, no more notes. But I found myself checking the sky at dusk, parking my truck under streetlights, driving a little slower to see if anyone would appear behind me. Never did. A week later, I ran into a retired sheriff at the hardware store. I asked him casually if anyone ever reported seeing strange aircraft over the Watkins Strip. He paused for a second, then said, "Funny you should ask. A few years back, we had some calls from around here. Nothing ever confirmed." He didn't ask why I was interested, just moved on to the nails and screws aisle. I haven't gone back out to the airstrip since. I still watch the sky sometimes at night, thinking about that hovering thing. The sedans never showed up again, but I can't shake the memory of the drivers. Not just their stillness, but the way they never turned, never reacted, like they were moving through the world in their own space, separate from everything else. I keep thinking about that note. Who left it? Why me? And why say I didn't see anything after I already had? The way it was worded, it wasn't a threat exactly, but it carried that same careful certainty, the kind of certainty that implies someone knows what I know and doesn't want me telling anyone. I still drive past that stretch of road sometimes, usually during the day, usually keeping to myself. No lights, no sedans, nothing, just the cracked asphalt, the hangars, and the wind in the trees. The experience hasn't stopped me from flying my drone or taking photos of abandoned airstrips for my blog, but I'm more careful now. I keep an eye on the rearview mirror, and I don't call the police about weird lights anymore. Not if I can avoid it. Even now, months later, when the sky is clear and the stars are bright, I find myself scanning for shapes, for movement. Sometimes, just at the edge of my vision, I think I see a dark shape moving silently, following the horizon. I look directly, and it's gone. But the memory of those sedans and that note stays with me. It doesn't feel like it ever left. It was late September, just after Labor Day weekend, when I drove up to Greeley, Colorado to meet a contact about an old UFO sighting from the 70s. I'd been interviewing people for a podcast I ran with a couple of friends, mostly about weird local history, missing planes, unexplained lights, that kind of thing. I wasn't any kind of expert, but I liked collecting stories. That week, I'd been digging through old newspapers at the university library and planned to meet one of the retired ranchers who'd reported strange lights over his fields decades earlier. I stopped at a small diner outside of town called Penny's Place. It was one of those squat buildings off the highway with a faded neon sign and cracked asphalt parking lot, wedged between a feed store and a closed-down gas station. The kind of place where you could still smoke out back, and the waitress knew every regular by name. It was a gray morning, misty, cold enough that the windows were fogged on the inside. There were maybe 4 other people in the place, 2 truckers at the counter, a couple in a corner booth, and the waitress, a middle-aged woman named Darla, who kept refilling coffee without asking. I took a booth by the window and spread out my notes, old photocopies of newspaper clippings about something called the Sterling Light, which people described as a silver disc that hovered over a wheat field for nearly an hour before vanishing. I was halfway through a cold omelet when 2 men walked in. They didn't look local. Both tall, thin, wearing black suits and white shirts, no ties. They didn't take their hats off, even inside. The fabric looked too perfect, like brand new suits from a store window that hadn't wrinkled yet. One was pale, maybe mid-40s, with slick dark hair. The other looked older, but his skin had that odd, stretched quality, smooth but too tight, like wax. They walked straight over to my booth without hesitation. "Mr. Halverson?" the pale one asked. That threw me. I hadn't used my full name for the podcast or online. I nodded anyway. Yeah, that's me. May we sit? The other said. His voice had a flat, metallic quality. Not robotic exactly, but like someone who learned English from an audiobook. They slid into the booth opposite me, perfectly synchronized, movements crisp and identical. I tried to play it cool, folding my papers, but something about the way they both smiled at the exact same moment made my stomach twist. You've been researching incidents, the older one said. He didn't blink much. Specifically, aerial phenomena. Yeah, I said slowly. Public records, mostly old cases. Have you shared your findings? With who? With anyone. I frowned. It's a podcast. I share them every week. They both tilted their heads slightly, like birds reacting to a noise. The pale one reached into his jacket and pulled out a small notebook, flipping it open. And the sterling light. What do you intend to do with that story? I shrugged. Just talk to someone who was there. Maybe record the interview. Their eyes didn't move when they talked. They just stared, unblinking. The older one smiled again, and this time I noticed his lips weren't quite in sync with the words. It was subtle, like bad dubbing in a movie, his mouth forming the sounds a split second late. You should consider discontinuing your work, he said, for your own well-being. Excuse me? The pale one added, it is not productive to examine what does not exist. I gave a short laugh, thinking maybe they were screwing with me, some prank from a local skeptic group. But their faces didn't change. Who are you with? I asked. They looked at each other, and again it was like a mirror, same motion, same timing. Then they both smiled. Wide, identical smiles that didn't reach their eyes. We're with an oversight department, the older one said. Which department? They didn't answer. Just stood up together, smoothed their jackets, and walked out. No check, no coffee, no hesitation. I sat there for a minute, staring at the door, half expecting them to come back in. My hands were shaking a little. I gathered my papers and went to the counter. Darla looked up from the coffee pot. You all right, hon? You look like you saw a ghost. Those two guys, I said, in the black suits. Do they come in here often? She frowned. What two guys? The ones I was just talking to. They were sitting with me. I turned to point, but the booth was empty. My half-eaten omelet was there, the papers, my coffee, but only one mug. Darla wiped her hands on her apron. You've been sitting alone since you walked in. You sure you're feeling okay? I just stared at her. No. There were two men. Never mind. She gave me this concerned look, poured me a fresh cup, and walked away. I sat there for a long time, trying to piece together what had just happened. I remembered their smell. Not cologne, not sweat, just nothing. Completely scentless. And how their clothes didn't seem to crease when they sat. When I finally got outside, their car should have been obvious. The lot was small, maybe a dozen spaces. My truck was the only vehicle there besides an old Ford that looked abandoned. No black sedan, no sign of anyone leaving. I drove off anyway, half glancing at my mirrors the whole time. About 10 miles down the highway, I noticed a dark vehicle behind me. Could have been black, could have been dark blue. I couldn't tell through the mist. It kept its distance, following at a steady pace for at least 5 miles. When I turned off toward the rancher's place, it didn't follow. The interview that afternoon felt off too. The old man, Frank Leary, was jumpy, kept looking toward the windows like he was waiting for someone. When I mentioned I'd stopped at Penny's place, he froze mid-sentence. They still open that place? He asked. Yeah, I said. Had breakfast there this morning. He stared for a second, then said, You see anyone in suits there? That made my chest tighten. Why? Just wondering, he said, and went quiet for the rest of the conversation. I left a little after sunset. The air had gone colder, fog settling low over the road. My phone lost service for a few miles near the county line. I kept glancing in the rear view, half expecting that same car to show up again. Nothing did. That night, back at the motel, I went over the audio I'd recorded from my meeting with Frank. Most of it was clear, but near the end, right when he asked about the diner, the background filled with a low, rhythmic hum. Not static, not interference. Almost like breathing, close to the microphone. When I tried to replay the part in the diner where I'd talked to the two men, there was nothing. I hadn't even turned the recorder on. I was sure I had. The next morning, when I went back to the diner, Penny's place was closed. A handwritten sign on the door said closed until further notice. The blinds were drawn tight and there were no cars out front. I called the number on the receipt from the day before. Disconnected. I still have the notebook they looked at. Not mine. The pale one must have left it on the table. Plain black cover, no writing, no logo. The pages inside are blank except for a single phrase written neatly on the first page. Do not speak of what is seen. I don't know how it ended up in my stack of papers or why I didn't notice until later that night. I just know I stopped working on the Sterling Lights story after that. I came home that night tired and anxious, and the first thing I noticed was that my front door wasn't locked. I live alone in a small bungalow on the outskirts of Cedar Hill, Missouri, and I'm usually obsessive about checking the locks. I remember thinking, no way, I locked it. I pushed it open carefully, stepped inside, and the house smelled faintly of smoke. Not the usual wood stove kind, more like something had been briefly on fire. My heart started to hammer. I grabbed the baseball bat I keep by the coat rack and walked through the living room toward the kitchen. On the counter was a single page from my notebook, the rest of it still on the table. The page was still smoldering at the edges, curling in on itself. I couldn't make sense of it at first. It was a sketch I'd drawn earlier that evening, a quick diagram of the lights people had been seeing over the old quarry near town. I'd been writing down witness accounts, approximate times, some crude diagrams. Somehow, one sheet had been set down and burned, and nothing else in the kitchen was damaged. I even checked the counters and floor around it. There were no ash marks beyond the page itself. I froze, half expecting someone to step out from the shadows. But there was nothing. The place was quiet, almost too quiet. My phone had been sitting on the charger, no missed calls, no messages. I snapped a picture of the page, then carried the smoldering sheet to the sink and soaked it. I called my neighbor, an older guy named Marty, just to ask if he'd seen anyone around. Nah, he said, you're imagining things. But even as I listened to him, I had this sense that I wasn't imagining it. Something had been here. I spent the rest of the evening pacing, checking doors and windows repeatedly. Around 1:30 a.m., there was a soft knock at the door. Not the kind of knock you hear from a neighbor, but something slow, deliberate. I peeked through the peephole. 2 men were standing there. Black suits, black overcoats, thin, sharp-looking. One held a small clipboard, the other just stood with his hands clasped in front. They didn't knock again. They didn't say anything. I opened the door a crack. Can I help you? Miss Halden? The man with the clipboard said. His voice was calm, flat, like someone reading from a script. Yes, I said, swallowing hard. Who are you? We're from the Historical Preservation Office, the other one said. He gave me a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. I blinked. The what? He tilted his head slightly, like a child learning a new word. We're concerned about the preservation of local history, of certain events. I frowned. Events? The first man held out the clipboard. We would like to ask you a few questions. About lights. You've seen them, yes? Yes, I said, voice trembling slightly. I document local sightings. That's why I keep these notebooks. Have you ever seen lights that do not make sound? That made me pause. It was the exact question, the way it was phrased, like someone had rehearsed it. My eyes flicked to the notebook still open on the counter. Yes, but. Not only that, the second man said, stepping a little closer, though still on the porch. Do you record the times? Patterns? I nodded slowly. Yes, that's what I've been doing. Trying to see if there's a pattern. Some of them move too fast to be planes or satellites. The first man jotted something on the clipboard. I noticed his lips were slightly out of sync with the words he spoke. Just a fraction, like he was reciting from memory and moving his mouth slightly ahead of his voice. The second man did the same thing. It made my stomach twist. May we see your notes? The first one asked. I hesitated. I can show you, but my words trailed. I didn't know why, but I felt an instinctive reluctance. They are important for historical record, he said. It is best they are accurate. We only wish to ensure the past is preserved. I swallowed. Why did you come here? I didn't tell anyone my address. The second man's eyes were steady. Sometimes people share more than they realize, and we must protect the record. I nodded slowly, though it didn't make any sense. I led them inside. They looked around without touching anything, hands clasped in front. The air felt cold, even though the heater was on. I showed them my notebooks, the ones I used to sketch sightings and write witness accounts. They flipped pages carefully, almost too deliberately, murmuring a few words that didn't quite match the movements of their mouths. I tried to pay attention, to notice details, but my mind kept wandering to the burnt page on the counter. "How long have you been documenting?" the first one asked. "Several months," I said. I I try to correlate times, locations. People often see the same things over weeks." He nodded. "Do you consider it possible that certain phenomena are not meant to be observed?" I blinked. "What do you mean?" "That is not for us to say," he said. He and the other man exchanged a glance, identical, as if rehearsed. Then, without warning, they set the notebooks back on the table, closed the door carefully behind them, and left. Not a word about payment, not a question about me beyond what they asked. Just silence. I stood there for a long time after, staring at the closed door. My front yard was empty, fog curling low over the grass. No footprints, no sign of a car parked nearby. It was like they had appeared out of nowhere and left the same way. I checked the burnt page again. It was still damp from being soaked, but the smoldered edges had hardened. I tried to read the text more clearly. Sketches of lights, notes about their speed, but it was partially illegible, blackened. Hours later, I went back to my desk. I had left my phone on, and now there were several missed calls. None from anyone I knew. All numbers blocked. All voicemail messages blank. I checked the security camera footage from the porch. The video started normally, showing the driveway empty. Then it skipped 10 minutes, and suddenly the video resumed with nothing happening. No black coats, no men, no sounds, nothing. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, the heater humming, notebook in hand, every small noise making me jump. When morning came, the fog had lifted. The street was quiet and the house seemed normal. I locked the doors, checked them twice, and made a mental note to install additional cameras. I still keep that notebook with me, and I glance at it often, wondering how they knew where to find me, why that single page was burned, and what exactly they meant about lights that make no sound. I've told friends bits of the story, mostly under the guise of a weird coincidence, but I can't shake the memory of those men, their synchronized smiles, the way their lips didn't quite match their words, the cold precision of their visit. Every time I hear a faint hum in the house at night, I think of them standing silently in my kitchen, watching, and I realize I may never understand why they came. I'd been driving through southern Kansas all afternoon, making my way from Wichita to Dodge City on a route I'd taken 100 times. It was late February, cold but clear, and the sun had started sinking behind the low hills by the time I pulled over on a rural stretch of K-156 to stretch my legs. The road out there is all nothing but wheat fields and occasional farmhouses. No streetlights, no traffic, just long, straight stretches and the wind off the plains. I had my truck parked on the shoulder, engine off, and I leaned back in the driver's seat for a quick nap. The heater was still warm, the radio off, quiet except for the faint rustle of the wind through the tall, dead wheat. I must have dozed for maybe 20 minutes because when I opened my eyes, the sky was completely dark, the last light gone. Then there was a flash. Bright. Blinding. White, like someone had fired a camera right in my face. It lit up the whole cab, reflected off the windshield, and for a second I thought my eyes were burned out. I sat up fast, heart racing, staring into the sky, but there was nothing there. No streak, no plane, nothing moving, just the empty, dark sky and the fields beyond. I leaned back for a second, trying to tell myself it was lightning or maybe some satellite flare, when I noticed headlights. A car, black, idling maybe 20 feet behind me on the road. No brake lights, no movement inside, just the beam fixed on the back of my truck. My stomach tightened. I rolled the window down and called out, "Hey, did you see that?" My voice sounded stupid, but I didn't care. Nothing. No response, no engine noise, other than that low idle, no one inside. I grabbed my phone to call 911 to report something, anything, and that's when I realized the signal was gone. No bars, nothing. I tried again, toggled airplane mode, tried a different network, still nothing. My fingers felt numb from the cold and the panic. I got out of the truck, shivering, and walked cautiously toward the car. "Hello? You okay? Did you see it?" The headlights were still on and the car wasn't moving. not even a twitch of the tires. Then I blinked. I don't know how long I looked away, but when I looked back, the car was gone. Not driving off, not pulling onto the road, just gone, like it had never been there. My knees wobbled a little, and I stumbled back to my truck, gripping the door handle for support. The radio static kicked in suddenly, a low hiss that made the hair on my arms stand up. I tried the phone again. Nothing. I sat in the cab, hands tight around the steering wheel, heart hammering, watching the empty road. I checked the clock. It had jumped forward almost 45 minutes. I couldn't explain it. I didn't get out and walk around. I didn't pass out again. I just sat there. But the time had skipped. When the phone finally showed signal again, the battery indicator had dropped a couple of bars instantly, like it had been reconnecting to a network that didn't exist before. Messages had piled up, calls I hadn't seen. Most were just notifications from apps, nothing urgent. But the weirdest thing was that my GPS had me logged at a location about 2 miles down the road, even though I hadn't moved the truck. I drove slowly, eyes flicking over the shoulder mirrors, over the fields. Nothing. No sign of the car, no headlights, no tracks in the shoulder. The asphalt was undisturbed. I tried calling a friend, Steve, who lived just outside Dodge City. He picked up after a few rings. I asked him if there had been any news of strange lights, crashes, anything. He laughed. Nope, just the usual boring February sky. Why? I didn't tell him the whole thing, just that I'd seen a weird flash and a car. He asked if I was okay, and I said I was, even though my stomach still felt tight and my fingers cold from the adrenaline. By the time I got to my motel, the road behind me was empty, the night quiet. I pulled in and checked the security camera footage from the front entrance. Nothing unusual. No headlights, no black car, nothing. Just the usual late-night traffic. A semi that passed around 10:15 and a lone sedan that pulled in and parked in the back lot, about 20 minutes after I'd passed. I couldn't shake the feeling that the black car had been real, that I'd seen it, that someone or something had been watching. I replayed the flash in my head over and over, trying to remember every detail. The whiteness, the way it lit up the cab, how it felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw headlights through the fog, felt the hum of an engine idling close behind. I kept my door locked and the TV on, volume low, just enough to hear background noise. The next day, I drove the same route back toward Wichita. Everything seemed normal, completely mundane. No flashes, no black car, nothing. But I kept checking my mirrors. Every curve, every turn, half expecting to see something gliding along behind me, unseen. A week later, I was telling the story to a coworker over coffee. She asked if I'd gotten any footage from my phone. I hadn't. I checked. There was no video, no pictures, nothing from the time of the flash. Just normal photos I'd taken earlier that afternoon. It was like the event had been erased, except in my memory. I've driven that road a few more times since, always during the day. I never see anything, never get that sense of being followed, but I still think about it. About the black car, the flash, the lost time. Sometimes when the sky is clear and the stars are sharp, I swear I can see a glow moving above the tree line in the distance, like a single static light watching. And I can't explain why my phone lost signal, why the car disappeared, or why it felt like the world itself had paused for that half hour. I came home safe. Nothing physically touched me, but something about it hasn't left. Something in the quiet weight of that night keeps me uneasy every time I drive past that stretch of road. The green light came out of nowhere. I just finished shoveling the driveway after the first heavy snow of the season, and the air was that dry, biting cold that makes your cheeks sting. I was about to go inside when this flash, sharp, almost neon, lit up the entire backyard. It was only for a second, but it left everything brighter than midday. Snow glittered like I'd dumped 1,000 flashlights over it. I froze, holding the shovel in both hands. The air smelled like ozone, like right before a thunderstorm, even though there wasn't a cloud in the sky. I scanned the yard. No sound, no movement, nothing except the untouched snow and the tracks I'd made an hour ago. When I went inside and flipped the kitchen light, nothing happened. Not a flicker. Every breaker, every lamp, dead. I checked the fuse box. Nothing tripped. I called my neighbor Tom, but no dial tone. My phone showed full bars but said no service. I settled onto the couch with a blanket, trying to convince myself it was a blown transformer or something. I tried the stove, the microwave, the water heater. Silence. Even the clock on the microwave had gone dark. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at nothing, when the wind rattled the windows and the house groaned under the weight of the snow. About 2 hours later, everything came back on at once. Lights, fridge, TV, the heater kicking in. My phone buzzed, dozens of missed calls from Tom. When I grabbed my jacket and ran outside to check the yard, I nearly froze again. 2 men were standing on my porch, just standing, perfectly still. They didn't move when I opened the door halfway. They didn't even glance at me. Black suits, black overcoats, gloves, hats that made their faces look shadowed. One was tall, broad-shouldered, the other slightly shorter, thinner, but their presence was the same, solid, unnatural. I scrambled for my phone, trying to hit record, but when I looked back, they were gone. No turning, no walking off the porch, they just weren't there. I ran outside anyway, looking for tracks in the snow. Nothing. Not a single footprint. The snow around the porch was perfectly smooth, like no one had been there at all. Even the snow on the steps was undisturbed, no indentations, no melted patches from shoes. I went back inside, heart hammering. I kept checking the front window. The street was empty, nothing moving. The only sound was the wind through the pine trees at the edge of the yard. After an hour, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe hallucination from the cold, maybe my brain playing tricks after the blackout, but my gut told me otherwise. That green light earlier wasn't normal. And those 2 men, they weren't normal. I went to check the backyard again. There were no new footprints in the fresh snow from the flash. No sign of anything having moved in the yard except my own tracks. The pine trees were untouched, the fence unbroken, the snow smooth everywhere except where I'd shoveled. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them on the porch, perfectly still, staring at the door. I kept my phone on the nightstand, pointing toward the window. I didn't want to turn around to check because I was afraid they'd be there again. In the morning, the snow had fallen another 2 inches, completely covering the yard. I went back to the porch. Nothing. Not a trace, not even the slight indentation the snow usually leaves on a doormat. I didn't tell anyone, not my neighbors, not Tom. I still leave a light on in the living room when I go to bed, and sometimes when I look out the window, I think I catch a shadow at the edge of the yard, standing still, just watching. But when I blink, it's gone. I haven't seen them again. No flashes, no black suits, no unexplained presences. But that night, the green light, the blackout, their silence stays with me. It's the kind of thing you can't explain, and maybe that's what makes it worse. The snow was new, untouched, and yet it somehow seems like they were never there, even though I know I saw them. I was driving back from a client meeting on Highway 62, about 30 miles outside of Ashland, Oregon. The sky was overcast, the kind of low gray cloud that makes everything feel muted. I had the dash cam running like usual, just habit more than anything, and I wasn't expecting to catch anything beyond the usual deer or slow trucks. About 10 miles from my turnoff, I saw it. A silver disc, hovering just above the tree line to my right. It moved against the wind, slow and deliberate, like it didn't belong in the sky at all. I didn't scream, didn't even flinch at first. I grabbed my phone to start recording, but it moved faster than I could react. That dash cam I barely checked. Yeah, it got everything. I pulled over to the shoulder, heart thumping, just watching. The object didn't make a sound, no hum, no engine. Just that impossible smooth glide. Then it darted straight up and vanished into the cloud cover. I sat there for a good 5 minutes, not moving, not breathing much, just staring at where it had been. When I finally shook myself, I realized I had no service. My phone had been dead for a couple of minutes, even though it was fully charged. Weird, I thought. I got back in the car, drove home, and uploaded the dashcam footage to my laptop. The video was fine, clear. Silver disc cutting through the gray sky, leaves shaking in the wind beneath it. That night, I tried to go to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My backyard faces a small patch of woods, nothing more than a few acres, but I kept seeing movement in my peripheral vision. Shadows that didn't line up with the trees. I checked my front porch security camera. Nothing. Around 10:30 p.m., I heard a knock at the door. Slow, deliberate, 3 times. I peeked through the peephole. No one. I opened the door a crack, just enough to see the street. An unmarked black car idling about 50 feet down the driveway. 2 men inside. Black suits, white shirts, black ties, both wearing sunglasses despite the overcast night. I froze. My first thought was, don't panic, don't make this worse. One of them stepped out slowly, tall, posture stiff. The other stayed in the driver's seat. The guy walking up didn't speak until he was 3 feet from the door. "License plate," he said. Calm, flat. Not a question, more like a demand. I blinked. My plate?" "Yes," he said, "for verification." I hesitated. "Look, I don't know what this is about." He just nodded, took a small notebook out of his coat pocket, wrote my plate down. His handwriting was precise, almost surgical. The way he held the pen, not like a person, like an instruction. I asked him who he was. He didn't answer at first. Then, in a single measured movement, he said, "Department of Vehicular Oversight." He sounded, translated, like he was reading from a script written in another language. I thought about saying no, thought about calling the cops, but nothing came out. He just stood there, perfectly still. And then, almost in unison, the man in the car leaned forward slightly, and the one at my door nodded once. Both were looking straight at me without blinking. The guy at the door closed his notebook, turned, and walked back to the car. Silent. Tires didn't squeal. No engine growl. Just gone. I stood there for a long time, heart hammering, until I finally went back inside. The next day, I went to the DMV to renew my registration. They couldn't find my car. Not a glitch, not a typo. My vehicle, my plate, my VIN erased. I even asked them to check the archived records. Nothing. It was like the car had never existed. The woman at the counter looked at me like I was crazy. I went home, played the dashcam footage again, and it was still there, clear as day. The disc, the trees swaying. Everything. Nothing edited. But I couldn't drive the car anywhere legally. I didn't even get a ticket for it, which felt just as weird. Later that evening, I drove to the highway where I'd first seen the disc. Nothing. No footprints, no tire marks, no sign of anyone else. But I kept catching glimpses in my rear view, black car shapes that weren't there when I turned around fully. I tried telling friends, mostly just raised eyebrows, shrugged shoulders. No one really knew what to say. Even the local news laughed when I mentioned it casually. A few nights later, I saw a black sedan parked a block away. I swear the 2 men were inside, motionless, staring at my house. I didn't approach. I waited. After maybe 20 minutes, they just drove off. No headlights, no turn signal, nothing. Just gone. I haven't seen them since, but I checked the street lights, the neighbors' yards, my driveway, always looking. The dash cam sits in my living room. I watch it sometimes alone, hoping for a clue, but it's just the same footage. The disc, the trees, the wind. I've kept my old plates in a drawer now. They're worthless legally, but I can't bring myself to throw them away. Part of me keeps expecting them to show up again, asking for verification, checking to see if I'm still paying attention. And honestly, I think they might be. I got the envelope on a Wednesday morning. No return address, no postage, just slid under the door of my office sometime before I got in. I work out of a small building downtown, 3 rooms and a kitchenette that always smells faintly like burnt coffee. I freelance mostly, local stories for regional papers. Nothing controversial, nothing that would ever make someone sneak me an envelope. It was thick manila, no markings except for my name written in blue ink. Evan Marks. The handwriting was neat, like someone took their time. Inside was a single cassette tape in a clear case. A label across the front said, in all caps, "Not play." I laughed at first. I thought maybe it was a prank from someone at the Courier. I still had a few friends there who liked to mess with me. But when I held the tape up, I noticed something strange. The label was the kind of adhesive paper you buy in bulk, but it looked aged, yellowed around the corners, like it had been sitting somewhere for years. I didn't even own a cassette player anymore, so I had to go dig one up from the storage room and back. It was this old Sony handheld I used years ago for interviews. The batteries were crusted over, but I found a power cord that fit. When I hit play, there was about 15 seconds of static. Then, my voice. It wasn't a recording I recognized, but I knew it was me. The way I paused between thoughts, the tone, all of it. I was saying things I didn't remember ever saying. I talked about two men in black suits who came to my office asking about restricted materials. I said one of them had this blank expression that never changed, and the other kept repeating certain words like he was trying to remember how to pronounce them. Then the tape clicked and ended. I rewound it, played it again. Same thing. No edits, no splices, just my voice. I must have listened to it 3 times before realizing I was shaking. My first thought was that someone had edited old audio of me and put this together somehow. But I hadn't done any audio interviews in years, and even if I had, who would go to that much trouble? I tossed the tape back into the envelope and left it on the desk. I couldn't focus on work. Every time I looked at it, I got this weird pressure behind my eyes, like I was on the edge of remembering something that hadn't happened yet. Around noon, I decided to head out for a late lunch. When I opened the office door, 2 men were standing in the hallway, both in black suits, white shirts, black ties. They weren't looking at me right away. They were facing each other, motionless, almost like mannequins. Then they turned toward me at the exact same time. No hesitation, no difference in timing, like mirrors. One of them smiled, or at least tried to. It didn't reach his eyes. The other just stood still, holding a black leather folder. The smiling one said, "Mr. Marks, we are here to retrieve the misplaced materials." His voice was deep but flat, like a recording played through an old speaker. I froze. I didn't say anything for a second, then managed, "What materials?" "The items delivered to your premises," the other man said. His speech was off, too precise, like he was reading phonetics. "They are not for public handling." I thought about lying, saying I hadn't received anything, but before I could, the smiling one tilted his head slightly and said, "The cassette." That was when I noticed both of them were wearing black gloves. Not the soft kind you'd wear in winter, more like uniform gloves, stiff and polished. I said, "Who are you with?" They both answered at once, same words, same rhythm. "We're with the Department of Archival Security." I'd never heard of that, but the way they said it didn't sound like something made up. It sounded like they believed it. I told them to wait while I went to get the envelope. My plan was to slip out the back door and call the police from the diner across the street. But when I stepped into my office, they followed me without a sound. I didn't hear footsteps. They were just suddenly behind me. I picked up the envelope and turned around, but only one man was there. The other was gone. The door hadn't opened. I didn't hear it close. The remaining man reached out his hand, palm up. "Thank you," he said. Before I gave it to him, I said, "Who sent it to me?" He paused. The air in the room felt heavier somehow, like the heater had shut off. Then he said, "You did." I didn't move. I don't even think I blinked. He took the envelope from my hand and turned toward the hallway. I followed a few steps behind, but when I reached the doorway, he was gone. The hall was empty. Both of them were. I went to the front door of the building. No cars outside. It was a quiet day, overcast, a few snow flurries. My reflection in the glass looked pale, washed out. I sat at my desk for the rest of the afternoon, trying to make sense of it. I kept replaying everything. The tape, their voices, what he'd said about me sending it. I thought maybe they'd swapped it with a blank tape, so I went through my desk drawers and found a different recorder, just to check. I pressed play, static again, but underneath faintly was their voices, not mine. The words were hard to make out, but I caught bits. Interference, earlier than projected, return sequence. Then the tape cut off. I took the recorder home that night. Around 11, I heard someone knock on my door. 3 slow knocks. When I looked through the peephole, no one was there. The next morning, I checked the office. The cassette was gone, of course, but so was the envelope. Not just missing. The section of the desk where I'd set it looked cleaner than the rest. No dust, no scratch marks, like the surface had been polished or replaced. I tried calling building security to see if the cameras had picked up anything. The guy who manages the system, a kid named Luis, said the footage from my hallway was corrupted. He sounded uneasy, telling me that it wasn't the first time something like that had happened. For the next few days, I caught myself looking for them everywhere. Reflections in store windows, dark sedans parked too long near the curb, people in black coats standing by crosswalks. Always watching for a hint of those same faces. But nothing. No visits, no mail, no more envelopes. A week later, I pulled my old voice recorder out of my bag to clear the files. The moment I powered it on, it autoplayed. My voice again, the same calm tone from before. They will come to retrieve the misplaced materials. Then static. The file's timestamp said it was recorded 2 days before the envelope ever showed up. I didn't play it again. I went camping with my friend Laura up near Fort Mountain, Georgia, late last September. It was one of those last warm weekends before the cold started setting in, and we'd been talking about it for months. Just two friends, a cooler full of beer, and no cell service for a couple of days. We drove up Friday after work, set up camp before dark, and sat around the fire drinking cheap whiskey and talking about stupid stuff until the stars came out. It was after midnight when I saw it. I was sitting by the fire, tossing in sticks, and Laura was leaning back in her folding chair, staring at the sky. We'd been trying to spot satellites. She suddenly pointed above the tree line and said, "That one's too low." There was a light, white but not harsh, moving slowly across the sky. At first I thought it was a plane, but it wasn't blinking, and it wasn't flying straight. It would move in a line, stop completely at half, then dart sideways faster than anything I'd ever seen. No sound, nothing, just dead quiet. We both stood up. I remember the air going really still, like even the crickets stopped. Then, after maybe 20 seconds, the light flared green for a split second and shot straight up. Gone. We didn't sleep much after that. I remember Laura laughing nervously, saying she didn't want to get probed. I threw a rock at her for that one. We stayed up until the fire burned out, and I remember talking about how weird it was that it moved like it wasn't affected by gravity. Eventually, we crashed in our tents. That's all I thought it was, a weird but cool experience. 2 days later, I called Laura. I figured she'd probably looked up something online, or maybe found a local explanation. When she picked up, I said, "You still thinking about that light?" She asked, "What light?" I laughed, thinking she was messing with me. "Come on, Friday night? Over the trees? That weird thing that stopped midair?" She was quiet for a second, then said, "Dylan, I wasn't camping with you on Friday. I was at my parents' house all weekend." I thought she was joking, but she wasn't. She told me she'd bailed on the trip earlier that week because of work. She even sent me a photo from that Friday of her and her mom at some diner. Same date, same time. I checked my own photos. I had a picture from the campsite, but she wasn't in it. Her chair was empty. I went through my phone gallery. Every picture I thought I'd taken of us that night only showed one chair, one sleeping bag, one beer bottle. I didn't understand. I could hear her voice in my head from that night. I could picture her laughing, the way she leaned her head back to look at the stars. I remember the sound of her opening a beer. I even remember her phone lighting up her face for a second when she checked the time. But she wasn't there. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up trying to remember if I'd seen her get out of the car when we arrived, if I'd seen her set up her tent. I couldn't. It was like every memory that proved she'd actually been there just slipped through my fingers. 2 mornings later, I was driving to work down Highway 76. It's mostly empty that early, and the sky was still gray with fog. About halfway there, I noticed a black car in my rearview mirror. Looked like a Lincoln, or maybe a Chrysler. One of those big old sedans you don't see much anymore. At first, I didn't think anything of it, but every turn I took, it took two. I went through a drive-through coffee place and thought maybe I was imagining things, but when I pulled back out, it was still behind me. Perfect distance, not too close, not too far. I pulled into the lot behind my office, a small HVAC place on the edge of town, and the car pulled in too. I parked. So did they. That's when I realized there were 2 men in the front seat, both wearing black suits. It was already weird because no one around here dresses like that, especially not on a muggy Tuesday morning. The driver rolled down his window slowly. I was about to say something, maybe ask if they were lost, but he spoke first. "You weren't there either." That's all he said. His voice was even, like a statement of fact. I blinked, not sure if I'd heard him right. "What?" I said. He didn't repeat himself, just looked straight at me, eyes flat, face blank. The other guy didn't move, didn't even turn his head. They sat there for a second, then the window went up and the car backed out of the lot, smooth, steady, like a robot was driving. I stood there until they disappeared down the road. I didn't tell anyone at work. I didn't even tell Laura, though I wanted to. The weirdest part was how ordinary it looked. That car wasn't glowing or making weird noises. Those men looked human, just wrong in some quiet way I couldn't explain. That night I checked my dash cam. It records automatically when the car's on. The file from that morning was gone. Every other day was there, clear as ever. But that one was missing. Not corrupted, not blank, just missing from the timeline. I started doubting myself after that. Maybe I dreamed part of it. Maybe I mixed up days. Maybe Laura was right, and I'd been alone that night. But if I'd been alone, who was laughing next to me? Whose voice did I hear? About a week later, I drove past that same stretch of Highway 76 just before sunset. The sky was orange, and everything looked normal, until I saw that same black car parked off the shoulder, half hidden by trees. No one inside, no plates. I slowed down and pulled over about 20 yards ahead, trying to convince myself to just keep driving. Curiosity got the better of me. I walked back toward it. The engine wasn't running, but I could hear something faint inside, like a whisper or maybe static from a radio. The air around it felt charged, like standing near a live wire. I peered through the driver's window. The interior was spotless, too clean, and there was a folder on the passenger seat labeled Friday. I didn't open it. I just backed away, got in my truck, and left. The next morning, the car was gone. No tire tracks on the shoulder, no sign anyone had ever been there. I've tried to find that campsite again since, but the dirt road that led there doesn't look the same. I drove around for hours one weekend and couldn't find the same clearing. Couldn't even find the tree with the bent trunk where we'd tied the tarp. Laura stopped answering my texts after I asked about it again, said I was creeping her out. Sometimes when I'm driving alone at night, I think about that green flash and the way her laugh sounded across the fire. And sometimes, in my mirror, I catch a glimpse of dark glass, headlights that keep perfect distance behind me, mile after mile until I pull over. Then they vanish, like they were never there. I don't tell anyone about it anymore. There's nothing to prove, nothing to show. Just a few missing minutes, a friend who says she wasn't there, and a voice that told me I wasn't either. I was driving home from Eugene with my girlfriend Megan late that Friday night. Rain had started just as we hit the stretch of Highway 58 that cuts through the Willamette National Forest. It wasn't a hard rain, just enough to blur the lines of the road and make the yellow stripes look like they were melting. We were joking about nothing, trying to ignore the fact that I'd been on the road for over 8 hours when she pointed to the sky. "What is that?" she said, voice low. I followed her finger and saw it. A cluster of lights, bright white and red, moving over the treetops. They weren't blinking like planes, not moving in formation like helicopters, just floating. Then they zipped in a line across the road, too fast to be any human-made craft I'd ever seen. Before either of us could say anything, our car shuddered and died. Just nothing. No warning lights, nothing mechanical. I tried the ignition, but it wouldn't turn over. Rain was picking up now, hammering the windshield, and I cursed under my breath. "Great," Megan muttered, her hands gripping the dashboard. "Just great." I flicked on the hazard lights and tried to call for roadside assistance. No signal, not one bar, nothing. My stomach tightened. The forest was dark except for the rain glinting off the asphalt, and that feeling crawled up my spine, the one where you know you're not alone, even though you're in a car by yourself. Then I saw them, 2 men walking slowly along the shoulder toward us, black suits, white shirts, black ties. Their hair was slick, perfectly combed despite the rain, their shoes spotless even though the ground was mud. Their eyes didn't reflect the headlights. I mean, not even a little. It was like they absorbed the light. I rolled the window down a crack and called out, "Can we help you?" They stopped a few feet from the car. Both of them just stood there, silent. Then one said, without smiling or shifting his posture, "Do you require correction assistance?" "Excuse me?" I asked. My hands gripped the wheel. Megan was holding my arm, her eyes wide. "Correction assistance," the same one repeated, voice flat and calm. The other just stared at us. No expression, no blink. I laughed nervously, trying to break the tension. You mean like a tow? Roadside help?" "Yes," he said. But it didn't sound like yes. It sounded like an affirmation of something bigger. like he was reading from a manual. Verification required. I opened the door a little, just enough to step out, but Megan held me back. The rain was soaking through my jacket instantly, yet they stayed dry, clean. Not a drop on their shoes, coats, nothing. I noticed small silver instruments in their hands, almost surgical, and I felt my stomach drop. We can call someone," I said, fumbling for my phone again. Nothing. No signal. They didn't move, didn't react to the phone. They just waited. Then the first man leaned forward slightly, not speaking, just looking at the car. The second man mirrored him exactly. The whole thing felt rehearsed, like they had rehearsed this encounter 100 times or had been trained to move in perfect symmetry. I took a step back. "Look, I don't know what this is about. We'll figure something out." "You will comply," he said, almost like the words were being fed through him rather than coming from him. "Observation cannot persist beyond tolerances." I swallowed. The hair on my arms and neck was standing straight up. Megan whispered, "What the hell are they talking about?" They didn't answer. They just stepped back, turned, and started walking toward the tree line. Their pace was deliberate, slow, not running, not rushing, and yet they disappeared. Not in the sense that they ran out of sight. They just weren't there anymore. 1 second they were at the edge of the asphalt, the next, nothing. No footprints, no mud stains, no disturbance in the grass, just gone. I blinked and shook my head, thinking I'd misseen it. Megan was staring wide-eyed, frozen. The car, still dead, now felt impossibly heavy, like it had sunk into the road. I tried the ignition again. It turned over immediately. The lights flickered back on. The radio static hum returned. My stomach was knotted so tightly I thought I might throw up. We drove in silence for a while, both of us staring at the tree line, half expecting to see them again. Nothing. No car, no footprints, just rain falling and the highway stretching ahead of us. The next day, I went back to the spot with my work boots and flashlight, thinking maybe the rain had washed something in. Mud, leaves, tire tracks, nothing. Not even a mark where they'd been standing. Like the world had rewritten itself overnight. I tried to tell people, friends and coworkers. Most laughed. Some thought I was joking. I didn't bring up the strange lights first, just the black suits, and that made them roll their eyes harder. The lights? They either didn't believe me or wrote it off as a plane or reflection or some satellite. It's been weeks. The car is fine now, no issues. But every time I drive that stretch, I check the tree line, slow down at the curve, and grip the wheel a little tighter. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe some elaborate prank, maybe hallucinations after sleep deprivation and rain. But Megan saw it too, and she's not the type to exaggerate. I haven't seen them again. Not on the road, not in the parking lot, not at home. But every time a black car slows behind me or I catch a shadow out of the corner of my eye, I feel that same knot in my stomach. Like they're still watching, waiting for me to need correction assistance. And honestly, I don't think I'd ever refuse it if they came back. I was in Pioneer Square in Portland, playing my usual set on that little patch near the fountain. It was a sunny Thursday afternoon, early spring, the kind of day where tourists and office workers mix in this slow-moving crowd. I had my guitar, a small amp, and a cardboard sign that read, "Tips Welcome." Things were busy enough, people dropping coins, someone laughing at my off-key cover of a classic, the usual. I looked up for a moment while strumming and saw it. A silver, disc-shaped thing, hovering maybe 100 feet above the fountain. It wasn't moving like a helicopter or drone, not wobbling, not making a sound. It just hung there, reflecting the sunlight in this weird, sharp glint. I froze mid-strum. The fountain burbled, a pigeon cooed, but then something strange happened. The people around me stopped, everyone. Not like a pause in movement, but like the motion itself had been frozen for 10 seconds. The woman with the stroller froze mid-step. The guy in a suit with a coffee cup was caught in the middle of raising it. A kid leaning on the fountain had his hands suspended over the water. My own fingers barely moved on the guitar strings. And then I noticed them. 2 men in black, standing off to my left on the edge of the plaza. They weren't frozen. Their stance was deliberate, perfectly still, watching me. I blinked, and the world snapped back. People started moving again, dropping coins, talking, shifting positions like nothing had happened. The disc was gone. I rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe I just stared too long at the sun. But my phone was in my pocket. I had been recording the street set on Instagram Live because I wanted to upload it later. I fished it out, rewound the footage, and played that exact moment back. The freeze frame effect was there. Everyone around the plaza completely motionless for 10 seconds. But the two men in black, they were moving, slow and deliberate, walking, turning, watching me. Their faces were unreadable, expressions locked in that standard, impassive look you see in movies. Black suits, black ties, clean shoes. Nothing remarkable except that everything else was frozen. I closed the phone, trying to shake it off, telling myself it was a glitch or maybe my brain filling in gaps. I finished my set, collected my coins, and left the plaza, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but no one followed. That night, I replayed the footage again at home on my laptop. Same thing. The 10-second freeze, everyone paused mid-action, the men moving like nothing was off. I paused on their faces. They looked the same, I swear to God. One had dark hair combed back, sharp jawline. The other had a slight tilt to his head, like he was assessing me. Their lips moved occasionally, but it didn't sync with any words, like they were mouthing something I couldn't hear. I tried to explain it to a friend later, someone who's into urban legends and weird stuff. She asked if I'd seen anyone else near them, anyone suspicious, but I couldn't remember. They didn't blend with the crowd, they didn't belong there, and yet they didn't stick out either. By the time I went back to the plaza the next day, the spot where they had been standing was empty. Regular people moved normally, pigeons cooed, fountains splashed, nothing left behind. For days after, I kept seeing flashes of them in my mind whenever I walked through crowded areas. Two men in black, watching, lips moving slightly out of sync. Once, in a grocery store, I swore I saw the same dark-haired one near the cereal aisle. When I looked again, he was gone. I checked the footage again a week later. The 10-second segment was still there, but the movement of the men was different. I swear to God, in one frame, it looked like they were looking directly at me through the screen, and the tilt of their heads matched what I remembered from that day. My stomach turned, and I closed the laptop. I didn't play in Pioneer Square for 2 weeks. When I finally went back, nothing unusual happened. No frozen crowds, no hovering disc, no men in black, just the usual tourists, office workers, pigeons, and the fountain. But every time I set up near that patch, I feel it, like someone could just decide to unfreeze the world at any moment, and I'd be the only one moving, the only one noticing. I haven't told anyone else in person about the footage. People would laugh. People have to, right? But I can't bring myself to delete it. I keep it on a backup drive, hidden, and sometimes late at night, I play that 10-second clip over and over. Watch the crowd freeze, watch the two men move, watch them silently examining me. And I know whatever that was, it wasn't a prank, it wasn't a glitch of the camera. It was something else, something I don't understand, something that doesn't belong in the world. And the worst part is, I don't know why it noticed me, or why it's still watching. I haven't been back to Pioneer Square at peak hours since. I take side streets, quieter corners, and I never let my phone out in the open when I play. But sometimes, in a reflection, a window, or a darkened screen, I think I see them again. Two black suits moving against the frozen chaos of the world, just waiting for the moment I notice them. I don't know what they wanted. I don't know why me. I don't know if I'm supposed to do something. But I do know this. I keep playing my music. I keep recording. And I keep watching the edges of my world because they're probably still there somewhere, studying. It was around 9 on a Sunday night when I first heard the sound. It wasn't loud, more like a low vibration than actual noise. I was in the kitchen rinsing a glass when the windows started to buzz. It reminded me of how the air conditioner used to rattle the frame before I got it fixed, except this wasn't mechanical. It was deeper, steadier, almost like it was coming from the air itself. I turned off the faucet and just stood there, listening. The sound didn't fade. It pulsed, slow and heavy, and I could feel it in my chest more than I could hear it. I stepped out onto the back porch, barefoot, and looked up. The sky was clear, no wind, no stars, just that dull orange haze from the streetlights. The hum got stronger as soon as I opened the door. It was coming from above the house. At first, I thought it was a helicopter flying low. But there were no lights, no movement, no rotor sound. It was just this smooth, perfect tone hanging in the air. I walked out into the yard, my phone already in my hand. When I pointed the camera upward, the sound seemed to dip in pitch, not fade, just shift slightly lower, like it was reacting to me. Then I saw it, a dark shape directly above the roof. Not quite circular, not quite triangular, more like a smooth, flat disc with soft edges. The surface didn't reflect anything, even with the porch light on. It was like it absorbed the glow. I started recording, but I couldn't see much through the phone. The screen just showed darkness, with a faint blur where the thing was. I zoomed in, and right then, the hum stopped. The silence afterward was thick. I don't know how else to say it. It was like all the background noise of the night got sucked out. No crickets, no cars, nothing. And in that silence, it disappeared. Not like it sped off. 1 second it was there, the next it wasn't. Just gone. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, trying to figure out what I'd just seen when I heard footsteps. I turned toward the front of the house, thinking maybe one of the neighbors had seen it too. 2 men were walking up my driveway. They looked out of place right away. Both wore black suits, not the kind people wear to work, but those perfectly tailored ones you only see on TV. Black shoes, black ties, white shirts. No jackets or hats, but everything else matched. Their clothes looked brand new, like they'd just come out of plastic wrap. One of them was taller than the other, with slicked back hair that didn't move at all. The shorter one had pale skin and this oddly smooth face, like he didn't have pores. "Evening," the tall one said in a calm, neutral voice. "Did you happen to hear anything unusual just now?" I froze halfway between the yard and the porch steps. I didn't think they could have seen me filming. My phone was still in my hand, screen off. But the question felt pointed. "I don't know," I said. "Maybe a plane or something?" They both looked up at the sky for a second, then back at me, perfectly in sync. The shorter one spoke next. "We've had reports of a mechanical disturbance in the area. Nothing to be concerned about, we're just following up." His tone was polite, but his mouth didn't really move right when he talked. The words came out smoothly, but his expression stayed flat, almost like the sound wasn't connected to him. I asked if they were from the county or maybe an air base nearby. They didn't answer right away. Then the tall one said, "We're with a federal response unit, noise abatement division." I remember thinking that didn't sound real. They stepped closer, and I took a small step back toward the porch. The tall one smiled, or tried to. It looked practiced. "Did you record anything? Sometimes people do without realizing it." I lied and said no. He nodded, still smiling that off smile. Behind him, I noticed their car at the end of the driveway. I hadn't heard it pull up. It was a black sedan, the kind you'd see government agents driving in an old movie. No headlights on, no sound from the engine, and I couldn't make out any plates. The shorter one looked around the yard, then at the roof, like he was scanning. He didn't tilt his head, just turned his eyes slowly from side to side. After a moment, he said, "Everything seems normal now." They both turned back to me. "Thank you for your time," the tall one said. "If you hear the sound again, do not investigate. Contact your local authorities." I nodded, and they both started walking back toward the car. The tall one stopped halfway down the driveway and looked over his shoulder. "You should delete any videos you took tonight," he said quietly. "Sometimes these things carry interference." Then they got in the car. I swear to God, it didn't make a sound when it started. The headlights didn't come on. They just rolled backward out of the driveway, completely silent, and turned down the street. I stood there until they were gone, my heart pounding. When I finally looked down, the video was still on my phone. It showed the night sky, blurry and dark, and a faint hum in the background. Quieter than I remembered, but there. Then, right at the end, 2 shapes appeared at the edge of the frame, walking toward the house. The timestamp said 9:08 p.m. But when I checked the clock on my stove, it was 9:43. I didn't remember standing outside that long. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept thinking I heard that low hum again, faintly, like it was vibrating through the walls. Every time I looked out the window, I half expected to see that black car idling by the curb. The next morning, I went out to check for tire marks in the driveway. There weren't any. Not even footprints. Later that afternoon, when I opened my phone, the video was gone. Not corrupted or deleted, just gone from the gallery. I checked the cloud backup too. Nothing. That evening, a black envelope was sitting on my porch. No postage, no writing, just sealed shut. Inside was a single blank sheet of paper. That's when I stopped trying to figure it out. I stopped telling people to. My sister said it sounded like a dream. My coworker said it was probably a drone. But sometimes, late at night, the air starts to buzz again, low and deep. And I catch myself standing at the window, waiting for it to stop. It always does, eventually. And every time it does, the neighborhood goes completely still, like everything's holding its breath. I never go outside anymore when that happens. Not since that night. Because the last thing I saw before it vanished wasn't the aircraft. It was the reflection in the kitchen window, showing two men standing at the end of the driveway watching the house, perfectly still in the dark. I was driving home from the deli shift. The road's all soft with that heavy, wet snow that comes in upstate New York when the storm's been going for hours. It was past midnight. The town was a string of dark porches, and the sodium lights along Route 9A turned the falling flakes into a steady, slow glare. I'd been on the road maybe 20 minutes when the headlights showed up behind me. There's always traffic this time of night. Plows, a few big rigs, but these lights didn't ease past or flash their beams like somebody impatient. They appeared in my mirror all at once, bright and steady, and settled into the lane behind me like they'd been waiting. I glanced over my shoulder. The car was a black sedan, windows dark enough that I couldn't see inside. It stayed a consistent distance back no matter how I changed speed. If I pulled to 40, it stayed maybe 4 car lengths back. If I dropped to 30, same spacing. It didn't try to pass. At first I figured the driver was tired or lost, so I kept my speed steady and watched. The snow muffled the road noise, your own tires, the occasional crack of a branch. The sedan's headlights looked hard in the mirror, 2 white coins that didn't scatter in the flakes. There was a small, stupid part of me that thought maybe the driver was one of the regular guys who work nights at the paper plant 2 towns over. They wear all black and they drive that kind of car. But when I looked, the driver didn't shift his gaze, didn't turn the wheel, this felt ridiculous when I say it out loud, blink. I pulled off at the 24-hour Exxon near the junction, figuring if something was up I could wait and see. The station lot was mostly empty, a streak of tire tracks and a broken cigarette butt in the snow. The black sedan slowed behind me and stayed on the shoulder, headlights cutting straight through the falling flakes. I waited 15 minutes, nosed into a pump, killed the engine to warm up in the car. The sedan idled where it had stopped. No one came in, no one got out. The lights stayed on, steady. I tried to call Heather, my sister, because for reasons I couldn't explain, I wanted someone else to know I was being followed. My phone registered 1 bar, then the screen glitched, and the call dropped. I blamed the weather and called the police non-emergency number, but the voice on the other end was the generic, "I will transfer you," click, and then nothing. The line went dead. By the time I dug the charger and had the heat on full, the sedan had pulled off and disappeared into the white. I felt like I'd been holding my breath the whole time, and when it left, the sound in the car felt too loud. Heater fans, the drip from thawing snow off the mirrors. I kept the radio low and eased back onto the highway. The sedan was waiting again further up. Same distance, same angle in the mirror. I tried one more thing. I exited onto Windham Road, took the back route that curls behind the old mill, and ought to throw off anybody just following the main line. My speed dropped under the glare of overhanging branches, the streetlights giving way to the darker, more familiar glow near the river. The sedan followed, and when a county plow rounded the bend, it nudged forward to the next lane with me, keeping that same measured gap. It didn't signal once. It didn't try to get around me. That's when I started to worry properly. Not because of the car being there, but because of that not blinking thing. I kept catching myself looking for ordinary movement. Steering corrections, the tired head tilt. But the silhouette was still like a photograph. My hands were white on the wheel and my stomach had that sour, cold, nervous feeling you get before you run a red light. There was a stretch of road near my house with 3 driveways close together, and I planned to use that cluster to lose whoever was behind me. I swung into the first driveway and waited a beat, then pulled out and rolled down the next. I used every little turn and side street I knew, doing that awkward, nervous thing you do when you think you can shake someone. The sedan mirrored me exactly. If I slowed, it slowed. If I turned left, it turned left. There were no tire squeals, no flashes of headlights, nothing to signal error or hurry. It was like being followed by the same calm that sits in your chest when your HVAC kicks on. When I finally eased onto my own road, Maple Street, the one with the tall elms and the one lone street lamp by the post box, the black lights stayed behind me for a long, slow stretch. I could see my driveway up ahead, the path I'd shoveled that afternoon, and the little mound of salt on the curb. I pulled in and idled for a second, waiting, feeling ridiculous. The sedan slowed at the end of the road a little, and then, just like that, it was gone. One moment, two hard lights in the mirror, the next an empty trace of snow where there had been no tire tracks induced by leaving the shoulder. No engine noise, no drifting, no skid marks, nothing. I cut the engine and sat there with the heater fan ticking down, breath fogging in the cabin. Even the radio seemed to quiet in the sudden hush. I got out, tucked my keys into my pocket, and walked to the mailbox before going to the porch. The snow around the drive looked like it had all been waiting for me. No impressions beyond my own shovel marks and the faint ripple where my tires had compacted the path. There were no tracks from where the sedan had been parked on the shoulder, and there were no tracks leading away from the corner where it had waited. It was as if the lights had never been there. I locked the door behind me and fumbled with the bolt, because locking things felt like the only action left that might help. Inside, the house hummed with the refrigerator and the old pipes. I made tea and told myself to sleep it off, that I'd been tired, and the storm had made everything look stranger. I told myself the sedan driver had probably turned off on a side road, and I just hadn't seen the dust cloud yet. I didn't sleep well. I kept opening my eyes, thinking I heard the faint tick of car lights turning down the street, the way they sometimes slide like a second hand across a clock face. At 4 a.m., I opened the curtains and looked out. The street was empty. The lamp by the post box threw a pale pool that the drifting flakes scattered through. Nothing moving. Nothing parked at the corner. For a while after that, I avoided driving that stretch at night. When I had to work the deli again, I drove a different way home, a loop that cost me 10 minutes, but let me see more intersections and more people. I told Heather, and she said it sounded like a creep in a rental, like the late-night TV shows. She told me to call the cops if it happened again. I wanted to believe that was enough. It wasn't. 2 nights later, I had the same feeling on my way home, an emptiness in the rear view that filled all at once with a pair of lights. This time I had the dash cam running because I'd started bringing it on habit in case I ever needed proof for an insurance claim or if there was a bad driver. The lights came on, settled behind me, and the camera logged it. The file's a still, steady recording of my taillights, the falling snow, and then 2 bright beams in the reflection. When I rewound the footage at home the next morning, the headlights were there, exactly where I remembered them, and when the camera's frame caught a glimpse of the driver through the low-resolution tint, there was a shape, but no moving features. The camera didn't capture anything like blinking. I slowed the frame down and watched the dark patch in the front seat the way people watch a coin tumble in a slot machine, waiting for a turn that never comes. Each frame was the same. A face, a hand on the wheel, like a paper cutout. I took the footage down to the station when the sheriff had a free minute between reports. He watched it on his desktop and his mouth opened and closed once without sound. He said we could file a report, sure, and then he asked if anything else had happened. I told him I'd had phone issues around those times, calls dropping, a dead spot on Route 9A where my bars vanish, but he didn't write that down. He looked uneasy in that professional way cops do when a thing is more discomforting than illegal. "Keep your lights on when you drive," he said finally. "If you see it again, come straight here." A neighbor, Mrs. Kowalski, stopped by a few mornings later with a pot of soup when I mentioned the same streetlight incident. She's lived on Maple for 30 years and has a knack for seeing what people want to hide. "Weird town for weird nights," she told me, hands folded against her apron. She paused, then added, You didn't see anyone get out, did you? I told her no, that nothing had moved, and she clicked her tongue. Keep the porch light on, she said. You'll feel better. I keep the porch light on now. It throws a cone of yellow across the driveway and into the crotch of the elm tree. Sometimes when I get home late and pull in and the cones of street lamps smear the flakes, I find myself glancing in the rear view a dozen times before I turn the engine off. My eyes catch light at the periphery and jerk back. Once, while I was making a sandwich at 3 a.m., the headlights showed in the window across the street. Not at the corner, not in the mirror. Then they were gone when I blinked. My hands didn't stop moving as I finished the sandwich, but I kept watching the glass. Nothing has happened in daylight. The sedan never showed up during the day. My coworkers say I'm being paranoid and that cold and dark and overtime makes stories out of ordinary things. Maybe. Maybe I am a little jumpy. Maybe it was one disturbed driver who liked keeping his distance. But the dashcam file didn't show a blinking, breathing person. It showed a silhouette that managed to be in the world and not quite of it at the same time. My phone kept dropping otherwise normal calls around the times the headlights appeared. There were no tracks in the snow where the car had waited on the shoulder that first night. The sheriff shrugged when I pressed him about it, said, "Strangeness travels," and left it at that. I'm here. I locked the door. I checked the mailbox in the daylight. I shovel the same bit of sidewalk every morning. The snow keeps falling, and life keeps being the tiny chores and errands and the coffee at the deli. I haven't seen the lights in a week. The space where they filled my mirror is empty and ordinary again. But every time the sky goes blank and the late shift comes around, I find myself bracing, checking mirrors, as if the world behind me could conjure itself whole at any second. Lights and a still driver, and no explanation to offer. I didn't think much of it at first. It was a Thursday night, unusually clear for this part of Colorado, and the air had that brittle, late winter dryness that makes everything sound sharper. I was on my porch with my DSLR snapping photos of the sky. There'd been a light moving over the neighborhood, slow, almost deliberate, darting between houses and over trees. Nothing I recognized. Not a plane, not a satellite, not a helicopter. I got a few decent shots before it blinked out and vanished into the blackness. I put the camera down and went inside, expecting that to be the end of it. But then I noticed headlights across the street. I live on a quiet cul-de-sac, dead end, and seeing a car at that hour was strange, but not impossible. What made it odd was that the car was black, clean, and parked perfectly parallel to the curb, right across from my driveway. It was the kind of alignment that looked almost rehearsed. I squinted from the window. Two men sat inside, suits dark as the car, hands on the steering wheel, facing straight ahead. I didn't see them approach. 1 second the street was empty, the next the car was there, engine idling softly. I stepped outside, keeping my phone in hand, trying not to make it obvious I was watching them. The air had that stiff, cold bite of February, wind rattling the branches of the bare trees. The men didn't move, didn't acknowledge me. Their faces were obscured by shadows from the roof of the car, but there was something unnerving in the way they sat. Too rigid, like mannequins in an office window. I waved a hand in the air, half in greeting, half in disbelief. Nothing. They didn't even blink, or at least I couldn't tell. I felt stupid standing there, shivering, staring at a pair of strangers who probably weren't even real in the sense I understood. After a few minutes, I went inside, locked the door, and tried to shake it off. I made tea, sat at the kitchen table, and kept one eye on the street. Nothing happened. No footsteps. No car doors. No noise at all, except the occasional wind whisper. I went to sleep eventually, but I couldn't shake that feeling. Like I was being observed, watched carefully from just across the street. The next morning, I checked my camera. I expected to see at least a few photos of the light. Nothing. Not even the dark sky over the neighborhood. The memory card was blank. I thought maybe I'd deleted them by accident, but I hadn't touched the card since that night. I tried the phone, same deal. The photos were completely gone. Not corrupted, not hidden, just gone. It was like they'd never existed. I went outside to calm myself, walked down to the street where the car had been. Nothing. No tire marks in the asphalt, no footprints in the thin dust along the curb. The street looked like any other suburban morning. I called a neighbor, one I'm friendly with, and asked if they'd seen anything unusual the night before. They hadn't. They hadn't noticed anything at all, which felt worse than seeing someone. Being the only one aware of something strange in a neighborhood of 50 houses is unsettling. By mid-morning, I'd convinced myself that maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was a hallucination from staring at the sky for too long. But then my neighbor's dog started barking, and I looked down the street. There was a man walking slowly toward the end of the cul-de-sac. Black suit, hands at his sides, nothing in his posture but calm, deliberate movement. No hat, no bag, no obvious reason to be there. I ducked behind the blinds. He walked slowly, steadily, keeping his head straight, never looking around. He passed the end of the street and disappeared into the side road without glancing back. I kept checking the street over the next couple of days. Sometimes, late at night, I thought I'd see a shape in a dark sedan parked 2 or 3 houses away, but when I got close, nothing. The whole block looked normal. The only evidence of anything unusual was the memory of the light and that first car across the street. 2 days later, I was walking the dog around the neighborhood when I noticed a black sedan parked at the edge of the cul-de-sac. I stopped, pretending to tie my shoe. Same car, same dark, shiny exterior, same impossible neatness. The driver didn't blink as I glanced up. I swear for a moment his eyes were fixed straight at me, but impossible, because when I tried to wave, he didn't react. He just sat there, still, like a dark sculpture. I kept walking, trying to act normal, but I felt watched. Every turn I took seemed mirrored by the glint of headlights in a distance. The air felt heavier, tighter. I got home, locked the doors, checked all the windows. Nothing moved. The street was empty. And yet, the memory of the men in black sitting in that car, perfectly aligned with the curb, didn't leave me. Weeks later, I downloaded some software to see if I could recover the lost photos. Nothing. It was as though my phone had never recorded that night. I tried telling friends, but the way it came out, light in the sky, car across the street, 2 men in black, it sounded insane. They asked about weather balloons, satellites, drones. None of that explained the silence in the air, the way those men seemed to exist outside time, or the total erasure of the images from my devices. I never saw the car again after that week. Not the same one, not anywhere nearby. But sometimes when I'm up late with the porch light on and the street quiet, I think I see a dark shape at the corner of my vision. A silhouette too still, too clean, and I realize I'm holding my breath without knowing it. My camera sits on the shelf, memory card in. I don't touch it when I see that shape. It's as if the memory itself is fragile, and whatever was out there that night might come back if I try to capture it again. They arrived the first night I was alone at the cabin. I had driven down the coast to get away from the city, a week with a sketchbook and a cheap space heater, nothing fancy. And by the 3rd night, I was halfway through a thermos of coffee and thinking the whole thing had been a good idea. The cliff above the little beach was maybe 100 yards from the door, a carved-out notch of dark rock and dune grass that dropped straight into a slice of sand. I'd been watching the tide come and go all afternoon, and when the light died, the place went to that hollow, winded kind of quiet you only get when there's no one else for miles. I was getting the wood stove going when I saw them. 2 figures on the bluff, standing perfectly still and looking out at the ocean. At first I thought they were watching the water like any other people. Tide, seal, something. Then I realized they weren't bundled up. Not that kind of bundled up. They were in suits, dark suits, white shirts. Nothing like the fleece and parkas I'd packed. Their shoes caught the last light and didn't have any grit on them. Whoever they were, they might as well have been made out of a different weather. I stepped closer to the sliding glass and then went out to the porch with the mug still warm in my hands, letting the wind take the steam away. The air smelled like salt and old kelp. I called up to them, more out of politeness than anything. "Hey, evening, folks. You get up here okay?" The word left my mouth wet and small in the wind. They didn't move. They didn't move. Not even a blink. One of them leaned. I thought he might turn to look. He didn't. They were both facing the water, shoulders squared as if fixed to watch a long, slow movie. The taller one's hair was close cut and neat in a way that said he didn't do manual work. The shorter one had a face that looked too clean to be my imagination, nothing in it to tell age or habit. When I waved my arm, both of them turned their heads at the exact same degree and the exact same speed. It was small and mechanic, like two puppet heads rotating on the same axle. The shorter one cocked his head almost as if trying to hear something across the wind, and then, still not looking at me, the taller one called down in a plain voice, "Do you require assistance?" The word came down like a question, but not exactly. It sounded rehearsed, like a phrase someone had practiced once and kept in a pocket. I told them no, I was fine, thanks. And for the next 10 minutes, I hovered on the porch while the wind made the house creak and the gulls argued over a crab. They never spoke again. Every now and then, I'd catch them slipping into small mirrored motions, adjusting their jackets in unison, the same slide of hand over lapel, and I felt like I was watching a mirror of myself that didn't reflect what I did. At some point, the fog rolled in thick and fast, like someone had dragged a blanket over the bluff. The men remained silhouettes until they were swallowed. I put the mug down and went back inside, shut the curtain, and tried to tell myself 100 reasonable things. They were private investigators, they were part of a film crew, they had a broken down car and were waiting for a tow. None of it fit the way they were dressed or the way their shoes were spotless in sand. None of it fit the stillness. I slept like a man tuned to a metronome, up for an hour, dozing for an hour. And when I finally roused before dawn, I opened the door to check the tide. The beach was a pale, low place under a sky that hadn't decided if it was going to be rain. The first thing that hit me was how even the sand looked. There was a straight, narrow line leading from the bluff to the cabin door. It was not a trail of footprints, not a tracked, scuffed path. The sand lay flat, compressed in a perfect band, like someone had taken a steamroller through it, but only along a single, tight track. I walked down to it. Up close, the sand was packed and firm where the band was. There were no toe marks, no heel impressions, no disturbance of the grain. If someone had walked that line in shoes, there would be edges and little ridges and drag marks. There was nothing. The sand outside the band showed the wind scribbles and a few gull tracks. The band was pristine and wrong. It ran straight from the lip of the cliff to the bottom step on the porch, ending as though someone had taken a single, careful step onto the threshold and then vanished. I checked the bluff. The grass by the edge had not been flattened. The cliff face itself showed the usual gull droppings and brown streaks where rain had run. No prints in the sand up there either. If anybody had come down from that ridge in the night, they'd usually cut a ragged path or leave a trail of footprints in the dune. Not this. The band didn't start at a single point. It seemed to gather itself out of the sand and run like a line someone else had drawn. My first instinct was to call the ranger and file something ridiculous. Someone trespassing on private property at 3 a.m. But I didn't want to make a fuss. The ranger station was hours away in fair weather and unreachable now because the fog made the road slippy. I told myself to take photos and not to be stupid. I went back to the porch, grabbed my phone, and took a long series of shots, making sure the cabin's shadow cut across the band so I could prove where it led. When I looked through the images, the band was clear. There was no discoloration, no footprints. The picture showed the band leading straight to the threshold like a zipper line. After breakfast, cold, eaten standing at the sink, I walked the short road into town. On Main Street, the day felt normal. People getting cups of coffee, the post office window marked with a flyer for the summer concert. I told the owner of the hardware store, a woman named Jan, who shrugged and said things like, "coastal towns, you know," and asked if I'd had trouble with raccoons. I laughed, but I felt small. I could say, there were two men on the bluff in suits, and she'd tilt her head and tell me about the new roofing crews. He meant well, but there was that tilt of someone who'd lived near the ocean long enough to not be spooked much. By the time I got back in the afternoon, the wind had turned, and the sand was starting to blow soft. I went down to the beach again. The band was still there, like a scar on the grain. I knelt and ran a finger along the edge. It was compacted enough that my fingernail left only a light mark. I dug a little to see if there was anything under it, trash, foil, a footprint embedded, and found nothing but the same compact sand. The rest of the beach had the usual wind lines and the random shell pieces. The band was a thing apart. That evening, I got restless and walked up to the bluff, careful where the rocks drop off. The grass there was undisturbed. There were no impressions of boots, no cigarette butts, no bottle caps. A gull skittered past and shrieked. I stood for a long time, looking out, thinking maybe I'd see them walk out along the ridge and down, but the horizon stayed quiet and gray. On my way back, I saw a pair of scuffs in the sand at the top of the bluff where two grass blades were bent, like someone had placed a foot there for a moment and thought better of it. Close up, they were nothing, small impressions, easily produced by a deer or a kid's boot. I couldn't be sure. The last odd thing that week came on a Thursday. I was packing the car to go back to the city. I decided to cut the trip short, partly because sleeping alone felt different after the sand, and partly because I had work piling up, and I noticed the little brass key to the cabin gate was on the kitchen table. It had been hanging on the peg by the door when I left it the first night. I knew I hadn't touched it because I always leave it there when I go out. I don't have an explanation for that. The key was just on the table, clean as the rest of the place. I did what seemed sensible. I took a photo of the band on the beach. I put the key in my pocket. I stopped at the ranger station when the fog let up and told them what I'd found. The ranger listened, then wrote me a note and said they'd send someone by to check on routine. That phrase sounded like something from a bureaucrat who'd seen 100 similar strange nights and filed them away. He asked one simple practical question I hadn't thought about. Did you lock the cabin when you left last night? I said yes. Of course I had. He nodded like that proved something. On the drive north, the fog peeled away as though someone had pulled a curtain back. The radio popped with local weather, the sun was a low coin in the sky, and the little town shrank behind me. I kept glancing at the key in my pocket like it might whisper something. I drove with the windows cracked, the wind picking salt on my face. At a stoplight, a teenager with a dog on the hood yelled something about the score, and I felt the world reasserting itself in the simplest ways. I told a couple of friends when I got home, late and half asleep. They made the polite, interesting noises. One asked if I'd seen men in suits before, a joke because you hear that sort of phrase in whispered stories. I said, no, I hadn't. I don't know what they were. The word that kept popping into my head was watching. But I don't mean watched like someone looking at a house to take something. I mean watched like someone examining the sea. Maybe that's what they were doing. Maybe they weren't human, quite the way human is when you meet them in a grocery store. Maybe I only imagined the line of sand. Maybe the sand compressed because of tide patterns I didn't understand. I go back sometimes, not often. The band in the sand will show up in my head like a page I can't stop turning. The cliff is a place you can stand and feel small and very much in the middle of the world. And what I'll remember is the way two figures looked almost like they belonged on a postcard and almost like they didn't belong anywhere at all. I always check the sand now before I walk barefoot down the steps. I lock the door twice. I leave the light on when I sleep. I tell myself that life is full of little puzzles we can live with, and some of them don't want an answer. I was doing a training run up North Trail, the stretch that splits off from the service road and climbs toward Kingsley Ridge. It was late September, the kind of morning where the trees are half green, half bent toward fall, and the air felt thin even in the valley. I go up there a lot alone. It's 15 miles round trip, lots of steady climbing, and it clears my head better than anything else. That morning, the sky was the clean, hard blue you get after a dry front. I left town before sunrise because I wanted the quiet. The trail was empty at first, as usual, my shoes crunching on the frost-hardened dirt, the distant sound of a creek, the occasional rattle of a marmot. I like those hours when the world hasn't fully warmed up, when you feel the work in your muscles and think about nothing else. I also notice small things, the way light falls through pine and pines, the sounds that change when a storm is coming. I notice when something isn't right. There were a few little oddities before the main thing happened, things I remember because they felt off in that slow, accumulating way dread does. First, The birds went quiet. I mean, just fewer birds, a pocket of silence. One minute the slopes were full of that morning chatter, the quick calls and flutter of wings, and then for a stretch of maybe 100 yards, everything stopped. No blackbirds, no jays, not even the tiny insect-sounding chirps. The quiet was thick enough that I heard my breath more than I usually do. Then, about a mile up, my music player, which I'd set to shuffle, started skipping. Not skipping like an audio hiccup, but like it was stuck on the tiny bit of static between tracks. I pulled the earbud out to check, and the player froze on the screen for a second, and then went to the home menu. I shrugged it off as low battery and shoved it back into my pocket. A little farther on, rain clouds I'd watched skittering along the western horizon earlier apparently drifted by. A line of mist rolled through the pines, and the temperature dropped a few degrees like someone turned a dial. I zipped up my jacket and kept going. There was a faint scent I couldn't place. Metallic, like standing too close to a welder, but cleaner and lighter. It came and went with the wind. I passed a horseshoe turn where I usually meet a handful of hikers. That morning, there wasn't a soul. I waved at 3 different empty spots where I swore a jacket or a pack would be, like they'd been erased. At one point, I saw fresh prints that crossed the trail, clear boot marks, big tread like work boots, and I followed them for maybe 20 paces, thinking I might catch up to someone. The prints led to a flat rock and stopped. No prints forward from there, no sign of any path off into the brush, just a dead stop in the sand. The sky overhead had that hard late September light, and I felt oddly exposed, like a tape of the world had been cut. I took a sip of water and tried to make sense of it, telling myself I'd probably just missed the hikers because I'd gone early. The trail does that. Sometimes you get the place when it's hollow, and sometimes it's full. My watch was on, GPS blinking, heartbeat steady. I started up again and felt fine until I rounded a bend and came face to face with 2 men. They were standing in the middle of the path, side by side, shoulder to shoulder, perfectly still. Up close, I could see their clothes were odd for the trail. Black jackets with collars that suggested suits underneath, dark slacks and clean shoes with no scuffing. Not the fleece and orange that hikers wear up there. Not a backpack. Nothing. The taller one had hair cut short, like a service haircut. The other had a lined face and a neutral expression that didn't tell me anything. They weren't looking at each other. They weren't looking at the trees. They were both facing down the path toward the same point where I stood. For a moment, I thought they were just 2 guys who decided to stop there and watch the morning or make a call. So I slowed. I do that out of courtesy all the time on single track. Slow, step to the side, but they didn't move, not an inch, not a blink I could see. They held their posture the way store mannequins hold it, balanced, composed, a little stiff. I said morning because you say that on the trail. They didn't reply. I said it again, louder, and then I realized how absurd that was, talking to strangers who might be ignoring me. I stepped off the trail onto a narrow shoulder to give them room and walked by at a clipped jog so I wouldn't make them think I wanted to get past them too close. As I passed, the taller man's gaze fixed on me with a flatness that made the hair on my forearms stand up. He didn't blink, not a flinch, not a head turn. It felt like slipping through someone's photograph. I was halfway by when a weird thought crossed my head. Their lips seemed to move slightly out of sync with sounds in the air. Not words, exactly, just the micro-motion of mouths like something in the wind. Maybe that was my imagination. Or the angle. Your senses play tricks on you when you're alone in the mountains. I put in another mile and the path started to steepen. I expected when I glanced back over my shoulder to see them standing where I'd left them, but my stomach dropped because the space on the trail was empty. I slowed to a walk and looked down the polished single track. Nothing. No disturbance, no flattened brush, no footprints leading away. It was like they had been removed from the scene. I laughed, softly at myself, half with nervousness, half with embarrassment, and kept going. The sky was edging toward noon and the valley opened up in the distance, the mesas and peaks all crusted with the last of the season's snows. I checked my watch without thinking. It said 10:12. My watch is one of those GPS-enabled things that keeps time off satellites, and my phone had shown 10:12 when I last checked, so I didn't think anything of it. I ran, tried to push the hill because I had a hard run to finish, and the world felt taut and sharp in the way it does when you're properly tired. About 20 minutes later, I stopped at a small outcropping to take a drink and catch my breath. I set my pack down, reached for my watch to log the split, and the little screen blinked at me with 9:10. I blinked back hard enough that the beads of sweat at my temples shivered. 9:10. An hour behind. My stomach clenched the way it does when you misplace your wallet and know you left it on the counter. I laughed out loud, a short, startled sound, and smacked the face of the watch. The numbers jumped back to 10:13 like nothing had happened. I don't have a clean explanation for that. The watch is 8 months old, well cared for, and calibrated to satellite time when I sync it. I've dropped it in streams and banged it on rocks. It's been reliable. For weeks, I told myself the display had glitched or that the battery had hiccuped, but there was an hour where the watch and I disagreed about where I had been. I tried to reconstruct it. Did I sit down at a shaded switchback? Did I nap? I could not account for it. When I turned back down the trail toward town, I started seeing small, inexplicable things that fit the pattern of wrong. My phone, which had been at 72% battery when I started, showed 50% after a half hour, even though I hadn't used it. The stream water where I bottle up tasted faintly acidic for a sip and then normal the second time. A pair of hikers going the other way gave me a once-over that felt prolonged. Later, I would realize their eyes flicked toward the section of path I'd passed, and then away, like they'd seen something and decided not to engage. I told one of them, a woman in a blue windbreaker, about the two men when we sat on a bench near the trailhead tying shoes. She listened, face patient, and said, "There's been weird calls into the park this week. People reporting lights, weird phone service drops. I thought it was old-timers blowing smoke." She laughed, and I laughed with her, and we swapped trail notes, but the laugh didn't settle in me the way it usually does after a friendly conversation. At the parking lot, my car was exactly where I'd left it. Tailgate popped and door opened to stuff my shoes. The parking lot was crowded with day hikers filing out from the high meadows, normal life, but I still felt like I'd been through a seam in the world and come out the other side. On the drive home, traffic moved in that anonymous way, radio bouncing between songs and weather. I kept reaching unconsciously to check my watch. It kept the right time then. The phone behaved normally. I went back up a few days later in daylight, with a friend this time. Not to prove anything, but because I wanted to make sense of the jittering cul-de-sac of memory. We walked the stretch where I'd seen them. The place was full of ordinary things. Lichen on rocks, a cracked trail marker, a picnic table someone had carved initials into. No footprints, no marks in the underbrush where two men in decent shoes might have stepped. We did find the boot prints on the flat rock again, dark and pressed into the dirt for no obvious reason, and when my friend crossed to peer at them, he shrugged and said, "Odd man," and kept walking. I asked the ranger about calls. He said they'd had a weird week. A couple who said their watch stopped for a while, a woman who described being followed by a car with two men in it along the highway, a hunter with a story about lights. He didn't connect them into anything because his job is to be both cautious and peacemaker. He tapped a filing cabinet, made note in a small book, and gave me a flyer about proper trail etiquette. I'm not a believer in one thing or another. I am a runner who likes to get lost in the lungs and leg work of it, but I can't shake the texture of that morning. The way the birds paused, the metallic smell in the wind, the two men standing like props, the watch that betrayed me for an hour. Whatever happened on that stretch of trail was small in the record of the world. No headlines, no missing persons, just a little private wrinkle. I went back twice after that, at different times of day with different friends. Nothing else happened. But sometimes when I run by myself now, I pass that horseshoe turn and the world narrows for a moment. I catch myself checking shoulders and sucking in breath on purpose, as if that might steady something. The watch works fine these days, but I still look at it more than I used to. Counting the minutes like a man who learned an odd lesson in the middle of a morning run. You can be perfectly certain about where you are and still lose an hour without explanation. I was driving back to Austin from visiting my cousin near Fort Stockton. It was early June, still hot even with the sun going down, and I'd been on the road for about 3 hours. The stretch of Highway 190 between El Dorado and Menard is quiet, just flat land, ranch fences, and the occasional windmill. I'd been zoning out, half listening to a podcast, when I noticed a group of cattle bunched up near the fence line on the right side of the road. They weren't grazing, they were just standing there, all facing the same direction, staring across the field. I slowed down a little, maybe to 50, and looked out toward where they were looking. It took me a second to spot it. This bright orange light low over the hills, not moving, just hanging there. It wasn't a plane, there was no blinking pattern, and it didn't seem far enough up for that anyway. I watched it for a few seconds, then it dimmed, like someone was turning a knob, and went out completely. I didn't think much of it. Out there, you see weird stuff. Pipeline flares, towers, reflections, whatever. I sped up again, passing the herd, and that's when I noticed two black pickup trucks parked maybe 100 yards down the fence line. Both were angled toward the road, facing opposite directions, like they just pulled off in a hurry. The windows were tinted completely black. When I passed, I caught myself checking the rearview mirror. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then both trucks' headlights came on at the same time. I wasn't doing anything wrong, so I told myself to relax, but the timing felt too exact. I kept watching my mirrors. A minute later, they both pulled out onto the road behind me. Not fast, just casual, steady. The kind of driving you do when you're not in a rush but want to stay right where you are. I told myself they were probably ranchers or oil guys heading the same way. The thing is, they stayed exactly the same distance behind me. I'd slow down 5 miles an hour. They'd slow down too. I'd speed up a little, and they'd match it. No variation. It went on like that for miles, just the three of us. The sun dropping low and that hot orange haze on the horizon. Around Menard, the road curves a bit, and I took a left onto a smaller county road that eventually connects back to 87. The trucks followed. I tried not to look like I was checking my mirrors, but I couldn't stop glancing up. The lead one kept its high beams on, making it impossible to see details. About 10 miles later, I pulled over at a wide gravel turnout next to an old windmill and killed my headlights. I figured if they were just going somewhere, they'd keep driving. They didn't. Both trucks stopped too, maybe 50 yards behind me, engines idling. I could see their headlights cutting across the gravel. The air conditioner in my car had been running full blast, but suddenly it felt hot and close inside. I remember resting my hand on the gear shift and realizing I was sweating through my shirt. We sat like that for a while. I don't know how long, maybe a minute, maybe 5. Then, almost in sync, the trucks turned off their headlights. No brake lights, no door slams, just black. I waited. I tried to make out silhouettes or movement, but the light had faded to that point where everything's just shapes and shadow. I couldn't even tell if the engines were still running. Finally, I started my car again and pulled back onto the road. My headlights swept over the empty fields, the fences, the dry grass waving in the heat haze that hadn't quite burned off yet. I didn't see anyone outside the trucks. When I checked my mirror, both sets of headlights came on again, perfectly timed. I drove faster, 70, 75. The road was rough and narrow, so I had to keep both hands tight on the wheel, but they stayed behind me, never gaining or dropping back. I don't know if they were coordinating by radio or what, but it was unnerving how exact they were. Then I hit a stretch of road where the horizon opens up. You can see for miles. I checked the mirror again, and they were just gone. No headlights, no taillights, nothing. The whole road behind me was empty. I slowed down, scanned both sides, even turned off my high beams for a second to see if I could catch their lights reflecting off the terrain somewhere. Nothing. I kept driving until I reached Brady and pulled into a gas station. I parked under the fluorescent lights by the air pump, just sat there with my hands on the wheel, trying to figure out what the hell had just happened. It was around then I remembered my dash cam. I'd installed it a few months earlier after someone sideswiped my truck in a parking lot. I reached up and pressed the little playback button on the screen. The time was right. The drive had definitely recorded. But when I scrolled through the footage, the stretch of road where the trucks followed me was blank. It jumped straight from the herd of cattle to me, turning onto the county road 10 miles later. No gap in timestamps, no corruption message, just nothing recorded. I checked the SD card on my laptop later that night at home. The files were all there, but that 20-minute span was just static. I tried reformatting it, tried viewing it in another player, but the same thing. Nothing but gray fuzz and no audio. Over the next couple of days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I told my cousin about it on the phone, and he laughed at first, said it was probably Border Patrol or oil guys running drills, but he got quiet when I mentioned the missing footage. He told me to just forget about it. The next morning, I went out to my truck to drive to work. There were fresh tire marks in the dust of my driveway, 2 sets, like someone had backed in and pulled out again. Not mine. I park under the carport. The spacing looked wide, more like a pickup. I went around to check my dash cam, and the mount was still there, but the camera itself was gone. Just snapped off, cleans, no pieces left behind. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see those headlights behind me, perfectly matching my speed. Around midnight, I heard a low rumble outside and went to the window. A black truck, not one I recognized, was parked down the street under a streetlight. It wasn't facing my house, just sitting there, engine running. I watched it for maybe 2 minutes before the lights cut off. When my eyes adjusted, it was gone. I didn't tell anyone else after that. I replaced the dash cam, but I stopped driving out that way. I even started leaving my porch light on all night, which I'd never done before. A few weeks later, I went through my phone gallery to show a coworker some pictures from the trip. I had one I'd taken near Menard, the one with the cattle lined up by the fence. But it wasn't there anymore. I checked the cloud backup, my email, everything. It was just gone. That was almost a year ago now. The weirdest part isn't the trucks or the missing footage. It's how normal everything felt while it was happening. Like none of it was out of place, like it was supposed to happen that way. I pulled off at a gas station somewhere along Highway 95 south of Tonopah, a little after 9 at night. I'd been driving since morning, coming up from Arizona on my way to Reno for work. It was one of those places that barely counted as a gas station. Just 2 old pumps, a single flickering light, and a small building that looked like it hadn't been painted since the 80s. The wind was cold, blowing dust across the lot. I parked beside the pump and sat for a second, stretching my fingers around the wheel. The only sound was the low hum of my engine and the soft ticking of the sign light overhead. The place was empty. No cars, no trucks, nothing. I got out, swiped my card, and started fueling up. That's when I noticed them. Two men standing maybe 20 feet away near the other pump. I hadn't heard a car pull in. They were just there. Both wore black suits, like actual suits, not jackets or work clothes, and black hats. Their clothes were too formal for the setting, and they stood perfectly still. I thought maybe they were travelers like me, maybe hitchhikers who had wandered up from somewhere, but something about them made me freeze. They weren't talking or even pretending to do anything. They weren't getting gas, not moving toward the store, not checking their phones, just standing side by side, both looking directly at me. I remember thinking maybe they were security guys or undercover cops. That stretch of Nevada can be weird. Some military stuff, old mines, even those weird restricted areas around Tonopah. But they didn't have that look. No badges, no gear, no car, just those black suits. I tried not to make eye contact and focused on the pump. I could feel them watching me, though, like the air had pressure in it. I told myself it was nothing. They were probably just locals messing around, but when I glanced over again, they hadn't moved an inch. The pump clicked off. I capped the tank, got back in the car, and started it up. I told myself to just leave, but curiosity got the better of me. I looked one more time through the windshield. They were both still there. But now they were closer. Not by much, maybe 5 or 6 feet, but I hadn't seen them move. That made my chest tighten. I checked the mirrors. Still no other vehicles around. I threw it in drive and pulled forward toward the exit, keeping an eye on them. Neither one turned their head to follow me, but I knew they were still facing my way. Once I hit the highway, I drove fast, too fast for that stretch of road. After about a mile, I looked back in the rearview mirror. The station's light was barely visible in the distance, just a tiny dot flickering against the desert. That's when I saw a flash. Not like lightning, more like a single bright pulse far on the horizon. It was white-blue, quick and clean, like someone had taken a photo. Then it was gone. I slowed down. The road was empty. My headlights only caught sagebrush and the long, straight stretch of asphalt. I told myself it was probably some distant plane or a reflection off the mountains, but my heart was racing. About 10 minutes later, I noticed headlights behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. People pass through that route all the time. But after another few minutes, the lights didn't get any closer. I was going about 70, and whoever was behind me kept exactly the same distance. Far enough back that I couldn't make out the vehicle, but close enough that I knew it was there. Every time I changed speed, so did they. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was someone else nervous about driving that stretch alone, but I started to feel watched again. Like the same kind of pressure I'd felt at the station. After another few miles, I reached a small pull-off area with a single streetlight and decided to let them pass. I pulled over and waited, keeping an eye on my mirror. The headlights didn't move. I waited maybe 30 seconds, then shut off my headlights to see better. The instant I did, the other car's lights turned off too. That scared the hell out of me. I sat there in the dark, engine idling, trying to figure out what to do. The desert was silent except for the wind brushing against the car. My phone had no signal. I thought about getting out, but the idea of standing alone on that road felt worse. After maybe 2 minutes, I turned my lights back on. When I did, the other headlights came back on too. But now, they were closer. That was enough for me. I floored it. I drove for at least 20 miles without slowing down, checking the mirrors every few seconds. The road curved, dipped, rose again. The lights stayed behind me the whole time, never gaining, never fading. Then, without any reason, they were just gone. Not turned off, gone. I slowed down eventually, expecting to see them come around the bend or appear over a hill. But the highway behind me was empty. I drove the next hour like that, trying to make sense of it, but nothing added up. I stopped again at a rest area near Beatty. There was another car there this time, a guy in a silver SUV with his window down, smoking. I parked a few spots away and sat there catching my breath. When I finally got out to use the restroom, I noticed something strange on my windshield, a single black business card tucked under the wiper. No logo, no number, no name, just plain black. At first, I thought it might have blown there, but the night was windy and it hadn't moved. The edges weren't bent or dirty. I didn't want to touch it, but I did. The card was thicker than normal, like plastic, and smooth enough that it almost felt oily. I tossed it in the glove box and didn't think about it again until the next morning. When I stopped for breakfast in Tonopah, I opened the glove box to look at it, but it wasn't there. I checked the floor, the seat, even under the mats. Nothing. I didn't tell anyone about what happened for a while. The few people I did tell thought I'd just been tired, or that I'd seen some kind of local prank. I wanted to believe that. But a couple weeks later, something else happened. I was home in Flagstaff by then, unpacking the car to clean it out. When I opened the trunk, I noticed a small line of dust on the inside of the lid, like someone had drawn a finger across it. The line curved into a shape I can't really describe. Not a letter, not a symbol I knew, just a looping curve, neat and deliberate. It was faint, like it had been done days ago, and it didn't make sense because no one had touched my car since I'd gotten back. I wiped it off, trying not to think about it, and went inside. That night, while I was making coffee, my phone vibrated on the counter. Unknown number. The message was short. We appreciate your cooperation. No link, no follow-up, just that. I deleted it immediately, turned off my phone, and left it off until morning. When I turned it back on, the message was gone. Not just deleted. No record of it anywhere. I told myself it had to be some scam or wrong number. But every once in a while, especially when I drive that same route, I catch myself checking the horizon for that flash again. And sometimes when I stop for gas, I can't help but scan the edges of the lot for two men in suits, standing perfectly still, not moving, not talking, just watching.